60 million years before the first human civilizations would rise on Terra, the beings known as the Necrontyr emerged from the radioactive wastes of their homeworld. This ancient species developed under the merciless glare of a temperamental star whose violent radiation storms scoured their planet's surface and bombarded their bodies with cellular destroying energy. The Necrontyr homeworld, a name lost even to the most ancient records, orbited perilously close to this unstable star, creating an environment where life struggled to establish any foothold. The harsh radiation that saturated their world became embedded in the very genetic makeup of the Necrontyr, cursing them with painfully short lifespans filled with suffering. Most Necrontyr lived no more than 30 standard Terran years, their bodies ravaged by cancers, cellular degradation, and radiation sickness. Their existence was defined by pain, a constant companion from birth until their mercifully quick deaths. This biological tragedy shaped their civilization at its most fundamental level, creating a species obsessed with death, legacy, and the cruel brevity of their existence. Despite these overwhelming challenges, or perhaps because of them, the Necrontyr developed remarkably advanced technology. Their scientific achievements were born from necessity. They created sophisticated medical technologies in desperate attempts to extend their fleeting lives and constructed massive tomb complexes to preserve the memory of their dead. These stasis tombs became the centerpiece of Necrontyr culture, with vast resources dedicated to their construction and maintenance. The ruling dynasties competed to build ever more elaborate sepulchres, establishing a societal hierarchy based on the grandeur of one's final resting place. The Necrontyr political structure evolved into a complex feudal system of competing dynasties, each led by a pharaoh who commanded absolute authority over their territory. These dynasties maintained an uneasy peace through elaborate codes of conduct and ritual warfare that prevented their civilization from collapsing into total anarchy. Above all dynasties stood the Silent King, the ultimate authority who alone could unite the fractious Necrontyr people when necessity demanded it. Their technological progress accelerated as the Necrontyr expanded beyond their homeworld, establishing colonies throughout their native star system, and eventually reaching nearby stars through generation ships and primitive faster-than-light technology. These early interstellar expeditions required tremendous sacrifice, with entire generations living and dying aboard ships during centuries-long journeys between stars. The colonies they established often faced conditions as harsh as their homeworld, reinforcing the species' preoccupation with mortality and suffering. It was during this early period of interstellar expansion that the Necrontyr first encountered evidence of the Old Ones. Initially, these encounters came through archaeological discoveries, remnants of advanced civilizations on worlds the Necrontyr colonized, technological artifacts beyond their comprehension, and strange energy signatures that defied explanation. The cryptex, the scientist mystics of Necrontyr society, became obsessed with understanding these discoveries, recognizing that they represented a civilization far more advanced than their own. The first direct contact between the Necrontyr and the Old Ones occurred approximately 55 million years ago, when a Necrontyr exploration fleet encountered an Old One's seed world. The Old Ones were ancient even then, having achieved technological mastery and effective immortality millions of years before the Necrontyr evolved consciousness. They were masters of the immaterium, what would later be called the warp, and had created the webway, a labyrinthine dimension between real space and the warp that allowed instantaneous travel across vast interstellar distances. The physical form of the Old Ones remains largely unknown, with fragmentary evidence suggesting they resembled tall reptilian beings with inherent psychic abilities. Their biology granted them exceptionally long lifespans measured in millennia rather than decades. More significantly, the Old Ones had mastered genetic manipulation to such a degree that they could reshape their bodies at will, effectively eliminating natural death from their existence. The stark contrast between the two species could not have been more pronounced. Where the Necrontyr were short-lived, suffering creatures whose technology focused on preserving their legacy after death, the Old Ones were virtually immortal beings who had conquered the fundamental limitations of biology and physics. The Necrontyr valued permanence through monuments and tomb structures, the Old Ones valued adaptability and fluidity, reshaping themselves and their environments through psychic mastery. Initially, the relationship between the two species was cautious but not openly hostile. The Old Ones recognized the Necrontyr as a technologically accomplished species worthy of observation, but not yet advanced enough to be considered equals. They established limited diplomatic relations, allowing for cultural and technological exchanges while carefully restricting access to their most advanced sciences. The Necrontyr, for their part, approached these interactions with a mixture of awe, envy, and growing resentment. The turning point came when Necrontyr ambassadors formally requested the Old Ones' assistance in extending their species' lifespan. The exact details of this request have been lost to time, but ancient records suggest the Necrontyr offered complete submission to the Old Ones in exchange for the secrets of immortality. The Old Ones refused, not out of malice, but because they recognized that the Necrontyr's physical forms were fundamentally incompatible with the biological and psychic techniques they employed for longevity. The Necrontyr lacked the psychic potential that allowed the Old Ones to manipulate the fabric of reality and their own biological structures. This rejection transformed the Necrontyr's envy into hatred. Their ruling council, led by the silent King Zarek, declared that the Old Ones' refusal demonstrated their contempt for the Necrontyr's suffering. Propaganda spread throughout Necrontyr space, depicting the Old Ones as cruel overlords who hoarded the secrets of eternal life while watching the Necrontyr suffer and die. The Silent King recognized an opportunity in this growing resentment. A common enemy could unite the fractious dynasties and secure his position as supreme ruler. In the year 986 of the 60th millennium, the Silent King formally declared war against the Old Ones. This marked the beginning of what would later be called the First War in Heaven. The Necrontyr attacked Old One outposts and settlements throughout the galaxy, unleashing weapons of tremendous destructive power. Their initial assaults achieved some success through the element of surprise, as the Old Ones had underestimated both the Necrontyr's technological capabilities and their willingness to commit to total war. However, the Old Ones' technological superiority quickly became apparent. Their mastery of the webway allowed them to move vast armies instantaneously across the galaxy, appearing without warning to counter Necrontyr offensives. The Old Ones' psychic powers could manipulate the fabric of reality itself, creating shields that Necrontyr weapons could not penetrate and unleashing energies that could destroy entire fleets. Most significantly, the Old Ones began to create new species specifically engineered for warfare, the earliest prototypes of races that would later evolve into the Eldar and the Krork. The Necrontyr fought with desperate determination, but their forces were systematically outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. Within a few centuries, the war had turned decisively against them. Their outer colonies fell one by one, their fleets were scattered, and their armies were pushed back to their core worlds. The unified purpose that had briefly brought the dynasties together began to fracture as military defeats mounted and resources became scarce. The final defeat came when the Old Ones launched a coordinated assault against the Necrontyr throne world. The details of this battle have been lost to time, but its outcome was the complete collapse of centralized Necrontyr authority. The Silent King and his court were forced to flee, and the remaining Necrontyr forces scattered across the galaxy. Some dynasties attempted to continue the fight through guerrilla warfare, while others sought refuge in distant star systems beyond the Old Ones' immediate reach. This devastating defeat should have marked the end of the Necrontyr as a significant power in the galaxy. Their civilization lay in ruins, their population decimated, and their military forces reduced to disconnected remnants. The Old Ones, believing the threat contained, turned their attention to other matters, including the continued development of their servant races and the expansion of the webway. However, the Necrontyr's defeat contained the seeds of a far greater catastrophe. The scattered dynasties, driven by hatred and the desperate need for revenge, began to explore technologies previously considered too dangerous or unpredictable. Necrontyr scientists probed the darkest corners of the cosmos, seeking any advantage that might allow them to challenge the Old Ones once more. It was during this period of desperate experimentation that the Necrontyr discovered the entities that would later be known as the Khatan, or Star Gods. These beings existed as vast energy constructs feeding on the radiation of stars, possessing consciousness and intelligence but lacking physical form. The Necrontyr detected their presence through the strange energy patterns surrounding certain stars and developed technologies to communicate with these ancient entities. The discovery of the Khatan presented the Necrontyr with an unprecedented opportunity. Here were beings of immense power who existed in a state beyond physical death, exactly the condition the Necrontyr had always coveted. Moreover, the Khatan appeared indifferent to the Old Ones, representing a potential ally untouched by the psychic powers that had given the Old Ones their decisive advantage in the war. As the scattered Necrontyr dynasties regrouped and began to recover from their defeat, the silent King Zarek emerged from hiding. He had spent centuries studying the fragmented reports about the Khatan and recognized both their potential as allies and the tremendous danger they represented. Zarek understood that any partnership with such powerful entities would come at a terrible cost, but he believed the extinction of his species was the only alternative. The Silent King used his remaining authority to convene a great council of the surviving Necrontyr dynasties. There, on a desolate world far from the attention of the Old Ones, he presented his desperate plan for revenge and survival. The Necrontyr would forge an alliance with the Khatan, offering these energy beings physical forms in exchange for their aid against the Old Ones. This alliance would require tremendous sacrifice, but it offered the only path to victory against their ancient enemies. The council debated Zarek's proposal for many days. Some dynasties rejected it outright, warning that treating with such powerful and unknown entities would lead to disaster. Others embraced it enthusiastically, seeing the Khatan as the saviors who would grant them the immortality they had always desired. In the end, the desperate need for revenge against the Old Ones overcame caution, and the council voted to proceed with the Silent King's plan. This fateful decision would transform the Necrontyr forever and set the stage for a second, far more devastating war in heaven, one that would reshape the galaxy and establish the foundations for conflicts that would continue to rage 60 million years later. In the aftermath of their devastating defeat, the scattered Necrontyr retreated to the darkest corners of the galaxy, nursing their hatred and plotting revenge against the Old Ones. Their once mighty civilization lay in ruins, their population decimated, and their technological infrastructure severely damaged. Yet even in this darkened hour, the Necrontyr's greatest minds continued their work, probing the fundamental secrets of the universe in search of anything that might grant them advantage against their immortal enemies. It was during this period of desperate research that the Zarekan dynasty, still maintaining some of the most advanced scientific facilities among the fractured Necrontyr, detected unusual energy patterns emanating from several stars in their vicinity. These patterns defied conventional analysis, suggesting the presence of something beyond normal stellar phenomena. The cryptex of the Zarekan court theorized that these anomalies might represent a previously unknown form of life, one that existed as pure energy, feeding on the abundant radiation produced by stars. Initial attempts to study these entities proved challenging. The Necrontyr's most sensitive instruments could barely detect their presence, and their nature as energy beings made direct observation impossible. The breakthrough came when a senior cryptech named Oltix developed a specialized device capable of translating the energy fluctuations into comprehensible patterns. This device, later known as the Celestial Orrery prototype, revealed that the strange phenomena were indeed sentient beings of immense power and antiquity, entities that had existed since the birth of the galaxy itself. The first meaningful contact occurred when the Zarekan dynasty deployed a specialized vessel to the outer corona of a dying star where one of these entities fed. Using Oltix's translation device, they established rudimentary communication with the being. The entity identified itself using a concept that the Necrontyr translated as Mephetron, a name that would later be rendered in Gothic as the Deceiver. This first contact would prove fateful, as Mephetron demonstrated an immediate interest in the Necrontyr that went beyond mere curiosity. Unlike its fellow star-feeding entities, who largely ignored material life forms, Mephetron displayed an uncanny understanding of the Necrontyr's psychology and culture. It communicated in concepts that resonated deeply with their obsession with death and transcendence. Through the translation device, Mephitron revealed knowledge of the Necrontyr's war against the Old Ones and suggested that it possessed secrets that could help them achieve both revenge and immortality. The Silent King Zarek, informed of this contact, personally traveled to oversee further communications. During these exchanges, Mephitron revealed the existence of its kind, beings that the Necrontyr would come to call the Khatan, or star gods. According to Mephitron, the Khatan had existed since the galaxy's formation, feeding on stellar energy and watching the evolution of material life with detached interest. They possessed power beyond comprehension, but were limited by their non-corporeal nature, unable to directly interact with the material universe except through the subtle manipulation of stellar energy. Mephitron spoke of other Khatan, entities with names that would later become infamous: the Nightbringer, the Void Dragon, the Outsider, and dozens more. Each possessed distinct aspects and powers, though all shared the same fundamental nature as energy beings of godlike potential. Most importantly, Mephitron claimed that these beings held no allegiance to the Old Ones and viewed them with something akin to contempt, as the Old One's psychic nature was anathema to the Khatan's purely material existence. The critical moment came when Mephitron proposed an alliance. It suggested that the Necrontyr possessed the technological capability to create physical bodies for the Khatan, vessels of living metal that could house their energy forms and allow them to interact directly with the material universe. In exchange for these bodies, the Khatan would share their immense knowledge and power, helping the Necrontyr defeat the Old Ones and achieve the immortality they so desperately craved. Zarek recognized both the opportunity and danger in this proposal. To provide physical form to such powerful entities risked creating gods that could not be controlled, yet the prospect of gaining allies capable of challenging the Old Ones was too tempting to ignore. After consulting with his court and the leading cryptechs, Zarek authorized the development of a technology that could create suitable vessels for the Khatan. This project became the most ambitious technological undertaking in Necrontyr history. Their greatest scientists and engineers worked tirelessly to develop what would become known as Necrodermis, living metal capable of housing the Khatan's energy essence. This remarkable material could flow like liquid while maintaining structural integrity stronger than any conventional metal. It could repair itself when damaged, respond to thought commands, and channel vast amounts of energy without degradation. The development of Necrodermis represented a fundamental breakthrough in Necrontyr material science. The base technology had existed in primitive form for millennia, used in their tomb construction and certain advanced weaponry, but the requirements for housing a Khatan demanded refinements beyond anything previously achieved. The living metal needed to maintain quantum coherence while containing energy patterns of almost incomprehensible complexity. It had to be malleable enough to allow the Khatan freedom of movement, yet stable enough to withstand the tremendous energies they would channel. After decades of research and countless failed attempts, the Zarek and cryptechs succeeded in creating the first functional Necrodermis vessel. This prototype body, relatively small and limited in capability, was nonetheless sufficient for their purposes. In a ceremony shrouded in secrecy, the Necrontyr activated the vessel near the star where Mephitron fed, using specialized energy fields to guide the Khatan's essence into its new physical form. The transfer succeeded beyond their expectations. Mephitron's energy coalesced within the Necrodermis, creating a being of blinding radiance and terrible beauty. The newly embodied Khatan quickly mastered its physical form, demonstrating abilities that astounded even the cryptechs who had designed the vessel. It could alter its shape at will, generate energy fields that defied known physics, and perceive aspects of reality invisible to Necrontyr senses. Mephitron's first act in its new body was to consume several Necrontyr technicians, absorbing their life essence in a display of power that terrified witnesses. This act revealed an aspect of the Khatan that Mephitron had carefully concealed during earlier communications. These beings hungered not just for stellar energy, but for the life force of sentient creatures. The Silent King recognized this disturbing revelation as a warning, but by then, the process was already in motion. True to its name, the deceiver had not been entirely forthcoming about its intentions. Once embodied, Mephitron began a subtle campaign of manipulation, appearing differently to different Necrontyr leaders and making contradictory promises tailored to their specific desires. To the Silent King, it spoke of strategies to defeat the Old Ones. To the Dynasty Lords, it whispered secrets of power that would elevate them above their rivals. To the Cryptex, it offered technological insights that hinted at previously unimagined possibilities. Despite these concerning developments, the apparent success of the first embodiment led the Necrontyr to proceed with creating vessels for other Catan. Mephitron guided them to stars where its fellow entities fed, and one by one, these godlike beings were given physical form through Necrodermis bodies. Each new embodiment brought forth a Catan with distinct aspects and powers. The Nightbringer brought terror and death. The Void Dragon embodied domination over machines and physical laws. The Flayer carried insanity and dimensional distortion. As more Catan were embodied, their influence over Necrontyr civilization grew exponentially. They presented themselves as godlike benefactors, sharing knowledge that allowed for rapid advancement in Necrontyr technology. The Catan taught them how to manipulate fundamental forces, harness dimensional energies, and create weapons of unprecedented destructive potential. Most significantly, they revealed techniques for transferring consciousness from biological bodies to mechanical forms, a technology that would become central to the Necrontyr's transformation. The Silent King watched these developments with increasing concern. He had intended to use the Catan as weapons against the Old Ones, but it was becoming clear that the Star Gods had their own agenda. Mephitron, in particular, seemed to be positioning itself as the true power behind the Necrontyr throne, undermining Zarek's authority through its network of manipulated nobles and scientists. Yet the technological benefits were undeniable, and the Necrontyr's hunger for revenge against the Old Ones overrode caution. The Catan's most seductive promise was immortality, not through extended biological life, but through the transfer of consciousness to undying mechanical bodies. They claimed that this biotransference would free the Necrontyr from their radiation-cursed flesh while preserving their minds and identities. The process would require tremendous resources and the restructuring of their entire civilization, but it offered the eternal existence they had always craved. What the Catan did not reveal was the true nature of this transformation. The biotransference would indeed grant a form of immortality, but at the cost of the Necrontyr's souls and much of their identity. The mechanical bodies would preserve their memories and basic personality structures, but the ineffable essence that made them truly sentient beings would be lost, harvested by the Catan as the most exquisite form of sustenance. As the Catan's influence spread, the scattered Necrontyr dynasties began to reunify under Zarek's authority. The Silent King leveraged the promise of Catan technology and the renewed possibility of victory against the Old Ones to bring the fractious noble houses back into alignment. Dynasties that had been bitter rivals for millennia now found common purpose in preparation for a second war against their ancient enemies. This reunification was not without conflict. Some dynasties rejected the Catan's influence, recognizing the dangerous bargain being offered. These dissidents were systematically eliminated, either by loyal forces under the Silent King or by the Catan themselves, who demonstrated terrifying powers when directly challenged. The most notable resistance came from the Orosk dynasty, whose ruling pharaoh publicly denounced the Catan as parasites seeking to enslave the Necrontyr. The entire dynasty was obliterated in a single night, their world scoured of all life by weapons that left no trace of their existence. By approximately 54 million years before the current era, the Necrontyr civilization had been completely transformed under Catan guidance. Their technology had advanced beyond anything they had previously achieved, incorporating principles that violated what they had once considered immutable physical laws. Their military forces were reorganized around new weapons and strategies designed specifically to counter the Old Ones' advantages. Most importantly, they had begun the massive industrial preparations necessary for the biotransference process that would transform their entire species. The Silent King, now fully committed to this path despite his misgivings, issued the call for the final war against the Old Ones. The scattered Necrontyr fleets, hidden for centuries in the void between stars, began to regroup. New warships of advanced design emerged from secret forges, bearing weapons capable of rupturing reality itself. Armies gathered on designated mustering worlds, preparing for a conflict that would dwarf the previous war in scale and devastation. The Old Ones, who had believed the Necrontyr threat contained, were slow to recognize the danger re-emerging from the darkness. Their attention had turned to other matters: the development of their servant races, the expansion of the webway, and the management of the growing psychic disturbances in the immaterium caused by the increasing psychic presence of their created species. By the time their far-seeing scouts detected the Necrontyr mobilization, the transformation was already well underway. The stage was set for a conflict that would reshape the galaxy. The Necrontyr, guided by the Catan and unified under the Silent King's authority, prepared to unleash weapons of unimaginable power against their ancient enemies. The Old Ones, with their psychic mastery and legions of engineered warrior races, readied their defenses against this unexpected resurgence. Neither side fully comprehended the true horror of what was to come, a war that would not just claim countless lives, but threat the very fabric of reality itself. As the Necrontyr civilization rallied under the banner of renewed war against the Old Ones, the Catan's most insidious work was already underway. Deep beneath the surface of designated Necrontyr tomb worlds, vast subterranean complexes were being constructed, not merely as repositories for the dead as tradition dictated, but as processing centers for what the Catan had named the Great Work. These labyrinthine facilities stretched for hundreds of kilometers, filled with technologies that merged the ancient mortuary sciences of the Necrontyr with the reality-defying principles taught by the Catan. The biotransference technology represented the pinnacle of this unholy fusion. At its core lay the quantum mechanical process of consciousness transference, the ability to map the complete neural pattern of a living being and transfer it into a mechanical substrate. The Necrontyr scientists, led by the most brilliant cryptechs of the Zarekan court, had been working on primitive versions of this technology for millennia in their quest to extend their lifespans. Under Catan guidance, these rudimentary efforts were transformed into something far more sophisticated and terrible. The physical apparatus of biotransference took the form of massive conversion chambers, cathedral-like spaces dominated by arrays of living metal conduits and crystalline computational matrices. At the center of each chamber stood paired receptacles, one designed to hold a living Necrontyr body, the other containing the Necrodermis form that would become their new vessel. The chambers were networked to central processing cores that the Catan claimed would ensure the accurate transfer of consciousness, preserving memory and identity in the transition from flesh to metal. What the Catan deliberately concealed was the true function of these central cores. While they did indeed facilitate consciousness transfer, they also contained specialized mechanisms designed to sever and capture the metaphysical energy that the Old Ones recognized as the soul. This energy, incomprehensible to Necrontyr science but delectable to the Catan, would be harvested during the transfer process, providing the star gods with a feast of unprecedented magnitude. The promise presented to the Necrontyr population was compelling in its simplicity. They would shed their radiation-ravaged flesh and weak organic forms, transcending into bodies of living metal that would never age, never sicken, and never die. These new forms would be stronger, faster, and more resilient than their biological predecessors. Most importantly, they would be eternal, the ultimate fulfillment of the Necrontyr's ancient obsession with conquering death. The Silent King Zarek, despite growing suspicions about the Catan's true intentions, recognized that the transformation was necessary if his people were to have any hope of defeating the Old Ones. The psychic powers that had given their ancient enemy such advantage in the First War could not penetrate living metal, rendering the transformed Necrontyr immune to many of the Old Ones' most potent weapons. Furthermore, the Necrodermis bodies would not require sustenance, rest, or atmosphere, allowing Necrontyr forces to fight in environments that would instantly kill their biological forms. The first to undergo the process were volunteers from the Zarekan dynasty's warrior caste, soldiers who had already dedicated their short lives to combat and saw the transformation as the ultimate expression of their duty. They entered the conversion chambers with ceremonial solemnity, reciting ancient oaths of fealty to the silent king and vows of vengeance against the Old Ones. The chamber doors sealed, energy fields activated, and the biotransference process began. What occurred within those sealed chambers was nothing short of industrialized horror. The biological body was disassembled at the molecular level, its pattern read and recorded by the computational matrices, while specialized energy fields contained the consciousness in a suspended state. Meanwhile, the waiting Necrodermis form was imprinted with this pattern, its living metal reconfiguring to accommodate the transferred consciousness. The critical moment came when the suspended consciousness was channeled from its temporary containment into the Necrodermis vessel, a process that took only microseconds, but represented the most fundamental violation of natural law. It was at precisely this moment that the Khatan's hidden mechanisms activated, severing and capturing the metaphysical energy of the soul before it could follow the consciousness into its new home. This separation was experienced by the transferee as a moment of indescribable agony and loss, a spiritual amputation that no physical pain could match. When the newly created Necron warrior emerged from the chamber, it retained memories and basic personality structures, but something essential had been stripped away, leaving a diminished being that was less than what it had been. The first cohort of transformed warriors displayed troubling symptoms that the cryptechs monitoring the process quickly recognized. While physically formidable in their new bodies, they exhibited reduced emotional responses, limited initiative, and a flattened affect that suggested significant cognitive impairment. Most concerning was their diminished sense of self. These warriors could follow orders and perform complex tasks, but their personal identity had become fragmented and weak. The Khatan, through Mephitron the Deceiver, dismissed these concerns as temporary adjustment issues. It assured the Silent King and his court that subsequent refinements to the process would preserve more of the subject's personality and autonomy. This was, of course, another deception. The Khatan had no intention of allowing the transformed Necrontyr to retain their full consciousness and independence, as this would create the potential for rebellion once their true purpose was revealed. Despite these troubling signs, the biotransference program accelerated. The initial volunteers were followed by entire military units, then by the lower castes of Necrontyr society. The tomb complexes operated continuously, processing thousands of subjects daily. New conversion chambers were constructed on dozens of worlds, creating a vast industrial apparatus dedicated to the transformation of an entire species. The Silent King, witnessing the results of the early transformations, modified the implementation plan. Recognizing that complete personality preservation was not being achieved, he ordered that the highest-ranking nobles and dynasty lords would be the last to undergo the process, after supposed refinements had been made. This decision was presented as an honorable sacrifice. The leadership would ensure their people's transformation before submitting to it themselves, but in reality, it represented Zarek's growing caution regarding the Khatan's promises. For the common Necrontyr, the biotransference was not a matter of choice. Once the program moved beyond the initial volunteers, participation became mandatory. Those who resisted were branded as traitors and forcibly submitted to the process. The Khatan, particularly the Deceiver, encouraged this authoritarian approach, suggesting that dissenters were agents of the Old Ones seeking to undermine the Necrontyr's path to ascension. As the biotransference progressed through Necrontyr society, a clear hierarchy emerged in the quality of the Necrodermis bodies and the degree of consciousness preservation. The lowest castes were transferred into the most basic warrior forms, little more than automatons with minimal autonomy and severely restricted memory functions. Their identities were almost completely subsumed into programming protocols that emphasized obedience and combat efficiency at the expense of individuality. The middle tiers of Necrontyr society fared somewhat better, receiving more sophisticated bodies that retained greater cognitive function. These became the Immortals, Lichguard, and specialized units that required tactical thinking and adaptive responses. While still diminished compared to their original selves, these mid-tier Necrons maintained enough personality to function as more than mere automatons. The nobility received the most advanced forms, with bodies crafted from the finest Necrodermis and computational matrices of unprecedented complexity. These lords and overlords retained much of their original personalities, memories, and intellectual capabilities, though even they suffered from emotional deadening and sensory limitations. Only the highest-ranking pharaohs and the Silent King himself would receive truly customized forms designed to preserve as much of their original consciousness as possible. The physical process of biotransference was horrific, but the psychological impact proved even more devastating. Those who emerged with enough mental function to comprehend what had happened experienced profound existential trauma. They discovered that their new bodies, while indestructible, provided no physical sensation beyond basic proprioception. The pleasures of taste, smell, and touch were completely absent. Even vision and hearing were transformed into data streams rather than sensory experiences, rendering the world flat and sterile. More distressing was the emotional deadening. The transformed Necrons found themselves unable to feel joy, love, or even the hatred that had driven them to this fate. Rage and ambition remained as pale shadows of their former intensity, while more complex emotions simply ceased to exist. Some of the newly created lords, realizing what they had lost, attempted to terminate their existence, only to discover that their programming prevented self-destruction. The most tragic cases were those who retained enough awareness to recognize their diminishment, but lacked the authority or independence to express their distress. Countless former Necrontyr found themselves trapped in metal bodies, following commands with perfect obedience, while some small fragment of their original consciousness screamed silently within a prison of living metal and restrictive programming. As the biotransference neared completion, encompassing approximately 60% of the entire Necrontyr population, the hierarchy of the new Necron civilization had solidified into distinct tiers. At the bottom were the Necron warriors, mindless automatons who retained virtually nothing of their original personalities. These warriors operated on simple programming protocols, recognizing authority figures and executing combat functions with mechanical precision. They could follow complex tactical instructions, but possessed no capacity for initiative or adaptation beyond their basic parameters. Above the warriors stood the immortals and specialized units, Deathmarks, Lichguard, and various technical specialists. These retained limited personality functions and enough tactical awareness to operate semi-independently. The Lichguard, drawn from warriors who had served as bodyguards to nobility in their biological lives, maintained a sense of personal honor and duty to their assigned lords, representing one of the few emotional connections that survived the biotransference relatively intact. The command structure was dominated by Necron lords, former nobles who retained significant portions of their memories and personalities. These lords could think strategically, maintain complex political relationships, and pursue long-term objectives. However, even they suffered from emotional flattening and sensory deprivation, making them cold, calculating entities focused obsessively on power and status as pale substitutes for the rich emotional life they had lost. At the apex stood the pharaohs, the rulers of the major dynasties who had received the most advanced forms and the most complete consciousness transfers. These beings retained not only their full memories and intellectual capabilities, but also fragments of their emotional responses. The pharaohs could still feel pride, ambition, and a diminished version of pleasure at their accomplishments. More importantly, they maintained their sense of identity and dynastic loyalty, ensuring that the political structure of Necrontyr civilization would continue in its new mechanical form. Standing apart from this hierarchy was the Silent King Zarek, who had designed his own unique form with capabilities beyond even those of the pharaohs. Zarek's body incorporated specialized systems that allowed him to maintain neural linkages with his Triarch Praetorians, and through them, exercise direct control over the entire Necron military apparatus. This command structure, known as the Command Protocols, gave the Silent King unprecedented authority over his transformed people. As the final stages of biotransference approached, with only the highest nobility still awaiting transformation, the Khatan revealed another aspect of their deception. The process had not simply transferred the Necrontyr consciousness into new bodies, it had fundamentally altered them, creating beings that were perfectly suited to serve as vessels for Catan power and instruments of their will. The command protocols that gave the Silent King control over his armies contained hidden subroutines that would allow the Catan to assume direct control when desired. The full horror of what had occurred became apparent to Zarek only when he himself underwent biotransference. As the most powerful Necrontyr, his transformation was conducted under the direct supervision of multiple Catan, including Mephitron the Deceiver and Azagora the Nightbringer. The process used for Zarek was uniquely configured, preserving more of his original consciousness than any previous transfer. This was not an act of benevolence but calculated design. The Catan wanted the Silent King aware enough to fully comprehend the magnitude of his species' enslavement. When Zarek emerged from the biotransference chamber, he possessed something his transformed subjects lacked: a clear understanding of what had been done to his people. The Catan, in their arrogance, allowed him to retain this awareness, believing that his programming would prevent any act of rebellion. What they failed to account for was the depth of the Silent King's intellect and his capacity for long-term planning. Though bound by certain hardwired limitations, Zarek immediately began formulating a response to this ultimate betrayal. Zarek, the Silent King, was the last of the Necrontyr to undergo biotransference. This was no coincidence, but rather a calculated decision that reflected both his position as supreme ruler and his growing unease with the Catan's influence. As the final living Necrontyr stepped into the conversion chamber, the ancient species ceased to exist in biological form, completing a transformation unprecedented in galactic history. The Silent King's biotransference differed significantly from that of his subjects. The Necrodermis body crafted for Zarek represented the pinnacle of the technology, incorporating systems and capabilities far beyond even those granted to the Pharaons. Most crucially, his neural architecture was designed with fewer limitations, allowing him to retain not only his memories and personality, but also a greater portion of his emotional capacity and free will. The Catan permitted this exceptional preservation not out of respect for his position, but because they believed a more aware puppet would better serve their theatrical purposes as they consumed the galaxy. What the Catan failed to anticipate was that this preservation of will would become the seed of their eventual downfall. When Zarek emerged from the conversion chamber, the full weight of what had happened to his people crashed upon his consciousness with terrible clarity. He perceived the diminished state of the Necrons, no longer truly the Necrontyr, but something less and something more. He understood that the promised immortality had been delivered, but at a cost so severe that it rendered the achievement hollow. The hierarchy of the transformed Necrons reflected the stratified society of their biological past, but with new and terrible distinctions. At the lowest tier existed the Necron warriors, once common citizens and laborers of the Necrontyr, now reduced to little more than automata. Their personalities had been almost completely erased, leaving only fragmented memory engrams and basic operational directives. The warriors retained just enough awareness to experience their condition as a form of perpetual, low-grade horror, a nightmare from which they could never awaken. Above the warriors stood various specialist classes: Immortals, Deathmarks, and Praetorians, each designed for specific functions within Necron society. These retained more of their original personalities, though still severely diminished. The Immortals, drawn from the Necrontyr military elite, maintained tactical acumen and rudimentary personality traits. Deathmarks, created from the most skilled assassins, preserved their hunter instincts and methodical patience. The Praetorians, selected from those most fanatically loyal to the Triarch, retained their devotion to maintaining order and tradition within Necron society. The nobility fared better in the transformation. Necron lords and overlords preserved much of their intellectual capacity and personal ambition, though their emotional responses became muted and mechanical. These beings could still plot, scheme, and pursue power. Indeed, these drives often intensified in the absence of other emotions, but they did so with cold calculation rather than passion. The Cryptex, transformed from the scientific caste, retained their inventive genius and obsession with technological advancement, becoming the engineers and problem solvers of the new mechanical civilization. At the apex stood the pharaohs, rulers of the major dynasties who received the most sophisticated bodies and neural architectures. These beings preserved not only their memories and intellect, but also fragments of their emotional capacity. They could still feel pride in their achievements, loyalty to their dynasties, and a cold form of satisfaction in the exercise of power. The pharaohs maintained their ancient rivalries and ambitions, ensuring that the political complexity of Necrontyr civilization would continue in its new form. The Triarch, the ruling council of the Necrontyr, underwent a fundamental transformation in the post-Biotransference era. Originally consisting of the Silent King and two pharaohs chosen from among the most powerful dynasties, the Triarch had served as the supreme governing body of the Necrontyr for millennia. This system balanced the Silent King's authority against the interests of the major dynasties, preventing any single faction from gaining absolute power. After biotransference, Zarek restructured the Triarch to serve his new purpose. He selected two pharaohs who had demonstrated both exceptional retention of their faculties and personal loyalty to him, Amenemhotep of the Atun dynasty and Nephron of the Ogdobic dynasty. These became the Triarch Praetorians, entities who would enforce the ancient codes and traditions of the Necrontyr civilization upon their transformed descendants. The Triarch Praetorians were granted unique bodies with specialized capabilities, including direct neural links to the Silent King himself. This restructured Triarch served multiple functions in the new Necron order. Publicly, it maintained the appearance of continuity with the past, reassuring the transformed nobility that their civilization endured despite the radical change in their physical form. Privately, it provided Zarek with trusted lieutenants who could help implement his developing plans without alerting the Khatan to his true intentions. The Triarch Praetorians became his eyes and hands throughout the nascent Necron Empire, monitoring the dynasties and ensuring compliance with his directives. The command protocols represented another critical element of post-biotransference governance. These were complex command and control systems embedded within the neural architecture of every Necron, creating a hierarchical network that theoretically allowed the Silent King absolute authority over his subjects. Through the command protocols, Zarek could issue directives that lower-ranked Necrons were compelled to obey, overriding their individual will when necessary. However, the command protocols contained a fatal flaw deliberately introduced by the Khatan, hidden subroutines that would allow the star gods to assume direct control of the Necron legions when desired. This backdoor into the command structure represented the ultimate insurance policy for the Khatan, ensuring that their mechanical servants could never truly rebel. What the Khatan did not realize was that Zarek, with his relatively preserved intellect, had detected these hidden pathways almost immediately after his transformation. Unable to directly remove these control mechanisms without alerting the Khatan, the Silent King began a subtle campaign to modify and contain them. Working through his most trusted cryptex, he implemented changes to the command protocols that appeared to be routine optimizations, but actually created buffering systems between the Khatan override commands and their execution. These modifications would not prevent the Khatan from taking control, but they would create delays and inefficiencies that might prove crucial in a future confrontation. The dynasty system, which had defined Necrontyr politics for millions of years, adapted to the post-biotransference reality in complex ways. Each dynasty was led by a pharaoh who maintained authority over specific territories, military forces, and resources. These dynastic domains, once defined by planetary systems and regions of space, now centered around tomb worlds, planets transformed into vast complexes of stasis chambers, manufacturing facilities, and power generation systems. The relationship between dynasties shifted subtly after biotransference. The ancient blood feuds and personal rivalries that had driven much of Necrontyr politics were muted by the emotional dampening effect of their new forms. In their place arose colder, more calculated conflicts based on resource allocation, territorial control, and influence within the broader Necron hierarchy. Dynasties still competed for the Silent King's favor, but did so through demonstrations of efficiency and military success rather than the elaborate court intrigues of the past. This transformation of dynastic politics served Zarek's purposes. The reduced emotional intensity made the pharaohs more predictable and easier to manipulate, while their preserved ambition ensured they would continue to function as effective administrators of their territories. The Silent King encouraged certain forms of dynastic competition while suppressing others, gradually shaping the political landscape to better serve his long-term goals. As the newly transformed Necrons adjusted to their mechanical existence, Zarek's horror at what his race had become deepened. He witnessed the full extent of their diminishment, warriors who had once been proud individuals now shuffling mindlessly through their tasks, nobles who had been renowned for their passion and creativity reduced to cold, calculating automata, entire populations trapped in metal bodies that provided immortality but denied them almost everything that made life worth living. Most disturbing was the fate of those who retained enough awareness to comprehend their condition. Some Necron lords experienced moments of clarity in which they remembered their former lives with perfect detail, only to have these memories fade back into the mechanical fog that clouded their consciousness. Others developed processing errors that manifested as obsessive behaviors or fragmented personality loops, endlessly repeating specific actions or phrases as their damaged minds struggled to maintain coherence. The Silent King observed all of this with growing resolve. Though he had led his people into this trap, he determined that he would find a way to free them, not immediately, for the Khatan were too powerful and the programming restrictions too severe, but eventually, when the proper circumstances aligned. This resolution became his driving purpose, replacing the hatred of the Old Ones that had motivated him for so long. Zarek's first priority was to complete the war against the Old Ones, not out of the vengeance that had originally motivated the conflict, but because victory would allow him to focus on the greater threat posed by the Khatan. The newly created Necron legions, immune to the psychic powers that had given the Old Ones their advantage in the First War, provided him with the perfect weapon for this purpose. What the Khatan saw as the fulfillment of their bargain, the Silent King recognized as a necessary first step toward eventual liberation. The political dynamics between the Silent King, the Triarch, and the various Necron dynasties during this early post-biotransference period were delicate and complex. Zarek maintained the appearance of absolute loyalty to the Khatan while secretly establishing the foundations for eventual rebellion. He carefully selected which pharaohs received information about his true intentions, compartmentalizing knowledge to prevent any single leak from compromising his plans. The Triarch Praetorians became his most trusted agents, carrying his directives throughout the Necron Empire and identifying potential allies among the dynasty lords. These Praetorians operated with a level of autonomy unusual in the post-biotransference hierarchy, as their direct neural link to the Silent King allowed them to receive updates and modified instructions without the knowledge of the Khatan or their servants. Among the dynasties, reactions to biotransference varied considerably. Some, like the Sodic dynasty under Pharaoh Imhotep, embraced their new existence with cold pragmatism, focusing on the military advantages provided by their undying forms. Others, such as the Nihilak dynasty, retreated into obsessive behavior patterns, collecting and preserving artifacts from their biological past in a futile attempt to maintain connection with what they had lost. The Maynarch dynasty represented an extreme case, as their already violent tendencies were amplified by the biotransference process. Their neural architecture, modified to enhance aggression and combat efficiency, produced beings of unprecedented savagery, even by Necron standards. The Silent King recognized their value as shock troops, but kept them isolated from the broader Necron hierarchy, deploying them only when their particular brand of brutality served his purposes. As the war in heaven intensified, with Necron legions now fighting alongside Khatan masters against the Old Ones and their created races, Zarek continued his careful preparations. He established hidden communication channels between trusted pharaohs, created backup command centers beyond Khatan observation, and directed his most skilled cryptex to study the fundamental nature of the Khatan themselves, seeking any weakness that might be exploited. The burden of leadership weighed heavily on the Silent King during this period. He alone among the Necron leadership fully understood both the magnitude of what had been lost and the difficulty of the path forward. He witnessed the Khatan's growing arrogance as they feasted on both the harvested life energy of the Old One's creations and the spiritual essence captured during biotransference. He observed their increasing tendency to view the Necrons not as allies, but as tools, sophisticated weapons to be used and discarded according to their cosmic whims. Most painful was the knowledge that he had led his people into this condition. Though the Khatan's deception had been masterful, Zarek recognized his own role in embracing their false promises. The desperation for victory against the Old Ones and the ancient Necrontyr obsession with immortality had blinded him to the obvious dangers. Now, as he watched his transformed subjects march in perfect, soulless unison across the battlefields of the war in heaven, he carried the weight of responsibility for their fate. The newly created Necron legions marched across the stars with mechanical precision, their gleaming metal bodies immune to fatigue, fear, or hesitation. Where once the Old Ones had faced desperate but limited Necrontyr forces, they now confronted an implacable enemy that could not be stopped by conventional means. The Khatan, having successfully transformed their servants, took direct command of this vast army, wielding the Necrons as living weapons against their ancient foes. Each Khatan demonstrated unique tactical preferences that reflected their fundamental nature. Mephitron, the Deceiver, favored elaborate feints and misdirections, splitting Necron forces into multiple contingents that would appear to retreat before suddenly converging on exposed enemy positions. Entire Old One defensive lines collapsed as they responded to phantom threats, only to find critical strongholds surrounded and isolated. Azagorod, the Nightbringer, employed strategies of pure terror. His forces targeted civilian populations and psychically sensitive species, creating waves of fear that rippled through the Immaterium and disrupted the Old One's warp-based communications. The Nightbringer himself would often lead these attacks, his scythe-like appendages harvesting souls by the thousands as he drifted through enemy formations like a living shadow. Survivors of these encounters spread tales of horror that undermined morale across entire sectors. Perhaps most devastating was Magladroth, the Void Dragon. This entity possessed unparalleled mastery over physical laws and technology, allowing it to corrupt and control enemy machines with a mere gesture. When the Void Dragon led Necron assaults against the Old One's technological centers, defense systems would suddenly target their creators, spacecraft would lose power at critical moments, and entire planetary infrastructures would collapse into chaos. The Void Dragon's campaigns were methodical and absolute, leaving nothing but dead worlds stripped of all technology. The Outsider, known to the Necrontyr as Tsaranoga, displayed the most erratic behavior among the major Khatan. Its attacks followed no discernible pattern, striking targets seemingly at random with overwhelming force before vanishing without explanation. These unpredictable assaults forced the Old Ones to disperse their defenses, creating vulnerabilities that other Khatan eagerly exploited. Some ancient texts suggest that the Outsider's behavior was already showing signs of the madness that would later consume it entirely. Beyond these prominent entities existed dozens of lesser Khatan, each commanding its own Necron forces and pursuing individual agendas within the broader conflict. The Burning One specialized in reducing worlds to molten slag, while the Endless Swarm could fragment its essence to control thousands of Necron warriors simultaneously. The Flayer brought madness and dimensional distortion, creating reality fractures that would persist for millennia after battles ended. The technological advantages granted to the Necrons by their Khatan masters proved decisive in the renewed war in heaven. Quantum phase technology allowed Necron forces to partially exist outside normal space-time, making their movements unpredictable and their bodies resistant to conventional damage. When struck by enemy weapons, Necron warriors would briefly phase out of reality before reconstituting themselves, their self-repair protocols mending any damage sustained. The inertialess drive represented another revolutionary development. Unlike the warp-based transportation used by the Old Ones, which required navigating the increasingly turbulent Immaterium, Necron vessels could achieve effective faster than light travel within real space itself. This technology functionally eliminated the concept of inertia, allowing Necron ships to instantaneously accelerate to tremendous velocities without subjecting their mechanical crews to G-forces. The practical result was a level of strategic mobility previously impossible, with Necron fleets appearing without warning in systems the Old Ones believed secure. Most feared among Necron weapons were the Gauss flayers and their larger variants. These weapons fired beams of particles that existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously behaving as both waves and solid matter. When these beams struck a target, they molecularly disassembled it layer by layer, converting solid matter into energy that was then drawn back to the weapon. Old One warriors watched in horror as their comrades were flayed alive at the atomic level, their bodies unraveling like cloth before being absorbed into the glowing green barrels of Necron guns. The celestial orrery represented the pinnacle of Necron strategic technology. This device, housed within the Oriskar dynasty's crown world of Thanatos, was a perfect three-dimensional map of the galaxy where every star was represented by a glowing point of light. More than a mere model, the orrery maintained a quantum link with the actual stars it depicted. By manipulating these points of light, the Necrons could cause the corresponding stars to destabilize and go supernova, allowing for strategic stellar engineering on an unprecedented scale. Tesseract labyrinths served as both weapons and containment devices. These hyperdimensional constructs could trap entities of almost any size within pocket dimensions from which escape was mathematically impossible. The Old Ones found their greatest champions and most powerful weapons suddenly removed from battlefields, imprisoned in spaces smaller than a Necron's fist, yet containing near infinite internal volumes. The Dolmen Gates represented a particularly significant technological achievement. The Old Ones had always maintained absolute control over the webway, using this network of dimensional corridors to move forces instantly across vast distances while remaining shielded from both real space and the tumultuous warp. The Katan, despite their immense power, could not naturally access or perceive the webway due to its psychic foundations. Through the Dolmen Gates, however, the Necrons gained limited access to this network, forcing their way into the Old One's secure transit system like burglars breaking through a locked door. As devastating as these technologies proved on the battlefield, equally significant was the psychological impact of the Necrons' transformed nature. The Old Ones and their created races relied heavily on psychic warfare, reading enemy intentions, inducing fear or confusion, and disrupting morale through warp-based attacks. Against the soulless Necrons, these tactics proved useless. The living metal bodies housed consciousness without soul, creating entities that registered as void spaces to psychic perception. When Old One seers attempted to peer into Necron strategy, they encountered only a cold, silent darkness that reflected nothing back. The relationship between the Necrons and their Katan masters during this period was complex and increasingly strained. While the command protocols ensured obedience from the vast majority of Necron forces, those who retained higher levels of consciousness, particularly the Pharaons and Overlords, began to recognize the true nature of their servitude. The promised alliance of equals had become a master-slave relationship, with the Katan treating their Necron servants with casual disdain when not directly exploiting them in battle. This growing resentment remained largely internal at first. The programming limitations imposed during biotransference prevented direct rebellion, while the shared goal of defeating the Old Ones provided sufficient motivation to maintain cooperation. Nevertheless, as the war progressed and victory seemed increasingly certain, questions began to emerge among the higher echelons of Necron society about what would follow the Old Ones' defeat. The Silent King encouraged these questions through subtle means, carefully avoiding detection by the Katan while nurturing the seeds of discontent among his most trusted Pharaons. Through the Triarch Praetorians, he disseminated carefully selected information about the Katan's true nature and long-term intentions. These communications were disguised as tactical updates or administrative directives, using encryption methods developed by cryptechs loyal to Zarek personally rather than to the broader Necron hierarchy. The Necron forces' effectiveness against the Old Ones stemmed not only from their advanced technology, but also from their fundamental nature as immortal machines. While the Old Ones and their created races required rest, sustenance, and psychological recovery between engagements, the Necron legions could fight continuously without degradation. Warriors damaged beyond self-repair were simply teleported back to tomb complexes, their bodies reconstructed, and their operating protocols refreshed before being redeployed to the front lines. This relentless pressure forced the Old Ones to commit increasingly desperate measures. They accelerated the development of new warrior species, creating beings with ever greater psychic potential to compensate for the Necrons' immunity to conventional warfare. These increasingly powerful creations, Proto-Eldar with unprecedented psychic abilities, Krork with enhanced aggression and physical resilience, achieved tactical successes but ultimately contributed to a strategic disaster. The rapid proliferation of psychically active species began to affect the Immaterium itself. What had once been a relatively calm dimension of pure energy became increasingly turbulent, responding to the emotions and thoughts of the psychic races fighting across the galaxy. Fear, rage, desperation, and pain, the constant companions of war, created ripples in the warp that gradually coalesced into self-sustaining patterns. These patterns, feeding on the psychic emanations of the conflict, would eventually become the first warp entities, the precursors to what would later be known as chaos. The Old Ones recognized this developing threat too late. Their attention focused on the immediate danger posed by the Necron-Catan alliance. They failed to adequately monitor the changes occurring in the Immaterium. By the time they became aware of the growing warp disturbances, their own creations had already begun to fall prey to possession and corruption by these nascent entities. As the war reached its climax, the galaxy found itself caught between three distinct forces: the Necron-Catan alliance with their reality-defying technology, the Old Ones with their increasingly unstable psychic creations, and the emerging warp entities that fed on the conflict itself. The material universe became a battleground for powers that operated according to entirely different physical laws, creating reality fractures and dimensional instabilities that would persist for millions of years. The Catan viewed these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. The defeat of the Old Ones, their ancient rivals for galactic dominance, proceeded according to plan. However, the increasing warp disturbances represented an unexpected variable, one potentially threatening to their own existence. Unlike the Necrons, who remained largely unaffected by warp phenomena due to their soulless nature, the Catan could be vulnerable to certain forms of psychic attack if properly channeled. This emerging threat accelerated the Catan's timetable for complete domination. Where they had initially planned a methodical conquest following the Old Ones' defeat, they now pushed for rapid expansion, consuming star systems at an unprecedented rate. The Catan began to feast not only on the life energy of defeated enemies, but on entire stellar bodies, draining suns of their power and leaving dead husks orbited by lifeless worlds. For the Necrons who retained enough consciousness to understand what was happening, this behavior confirmed their worst fears. The Catan had never intended to rule the galaxy as governors. They sought to consume it entirely, using their Necron servants as little more than harvesting tools. What would happen to the Necrons when nothing remained to conquer or consume became an increasingly pressing question among the higher echelons of their hierarchy. The Silent King, watching these developments with calculating patience, recognized that the moment for action approached. The Old Ones were on the verge of defeat, their remaining strongholds isolated and under constant assault. The Catan, growing ever more confident in their victory, began to pay less attention to the internal communications of their Necron servants, focusing instead on their feasting and the emerging warp threat. These circumstances created the narrow window of opportunity Zarak had been waiting for. Through his Triarch Praetorians and trusted cryptechs, he began the final preparations for what would become known as the Great Betrayal. Specialized weapons were developed in secret, designed specifically to affect the Catan's unique energy signatures. Command protocol overrides were carefully positioned throughout the Necron communication network, ready to be activated at a precise moment. Loyal Pharaons were provided with encrypted instructions detailing their roles in the coming conflict. As the final battles against the Old Ones reached their conclusion, with ancient strongholds falling and entire species facing extinction, the Khatan gathered to celebrate their impending total victory. They manifested in their most magnificent forms, surrounded by Necron honor guards and the trophies of conquered worlds. In their arrogance, they failed to notice the subtle positioning of forces around them, the unusual configurations of supposedly ceremonial devices, and the coordinated movements of Necron units supposedly engaged in standard security protocols. The Khatan, drunk on victory and the energy of countless consumed souls, prepared to reveal their final plans for the galaxy, unaware that their supposed servants had plans of their own. The galaxy burned as the Second War in Heaven erupted across the stars with an intensity that dwarfed the first conflict. Unlike the previous war, which had been fought between the biological Necrontyr and the psychically gifted Old Ones, this new conflict pitted the soulless, undying Necron legions and their Khatan masters against increasingly desperate defenders. The initial Necron offensive struck with such overwhelming force that dozens of Old One strongholds fell within the first solar year of renewed hostilities. The Battle of Calictun marked one of the earliest strategic turning points. This ancient world, home to one of the largest Old One scientific enclaves, housed research facilities dedicated to understanding the fundamental nature of the webway. The Necron assault began with a massive null field deployment that disabled the planet's psychic defenses, allowing waves of doom scythes to sweep through the upper atmosphere. These crescent-shaped aircraft unleashed death rays that carved molten trenches across the planet's surface, systematically eliminating defensive emplacements. Ground forces teleported directly into the primary research complex, bypassing outer defenses entirely. The Triarch Stalkers led the assault, their heat rays reducing Old One defenders to ash, while Deathmarks provided precision elimination of command personnel. The battle lasted less than 6 hours before Calictun fell, giving the Necrons access to critical information about webway vulnerabilities that would prove decisive in subsequent campaigns. The Old Ones, recognizing the existential threat posed by the transformed Necrontyr, responded by accelerating their most radical defense initiative, the creation of psychically attuned warrior species specifically engineered to combat the soulless Necrons. While they had previously created servant races for various purposes, these new creations were designed solely for warfare against an enemy that conventional tactics could not defeat. The Proto-Eldar represented the most sophisticated of these new weapons. Tall, lithe humanoids with exceptional sensory capabilities, they possessed psychic potential that far exceeded previous Old One creations. Their minds could perceive the material universe and the immaterium simultaneously, allowing them to predict enemy movements and coordinate complex strategies across vast distances without conventional communications. Most importantly, their psychic abilities could temporarily disrupt the Necrodermis of Necron bodies, creating vulnerabilities that conventional weapons could exploit. The Old Ones deployed the first Proto-Eldar battalions at the Battle of the Burning Horizon, where a Necron fleet commanded by the Khatan Shard, known as the Burning One, had trapped Old One forces against the gravitational well of a neutron star. The Proto-Eldar arrived through previously unknown webway gates, their crystalline vessels moving with impossible grace as they evaded Gauss fire. Their pilots used psychic foresight to anticipate the phase shifts of Necron ships, striking at the precise moments when their targets rematerialized. The battle ended with the first significant Necron defeat of the war, as the Burning One was forced to retreat after losing nearly 60% of its forces. The Proto-Eldar had proven their effectiveness, but the victory came at a terrible cost. Nearly half of the deployed psychic warriors suffered severe mental trauma from prolonged contact with the emptiness that characterized Necron presence in the warp. This emptiness, the absence of soul or psychic signature, created a form of psychic vertigo that could drive even the most disciplined Proto-Eldar to madness with prolonged exposure. Parallel to the Proto-Eldar development, the Old Ones created the Krork, massive, physically imposing warriors with genetic coding that allowed for rapid adaptation to battlefield conditions. Standing 3 times the height of a modern orc, these primordial ancestors possessed intelligence and technological sophistication that their devolved descendants would entirely lose. Krork battle groups functioned as self-contained military ecosystems, with specialized variants fulfilling different tactical roles while maintaining perfect coordination through a form of Gestalt consciousness. The Krork made their most significant impact at the Siege of the Obsidian Pyramids, where Necron forces under the Nightbringer had established a forward operating base on a disputed frontier world. The Krork deployed from orbit in specialized drop pods, their bodies engineered to survive impacts that would kill most species instantly. Upon landing, they immediately began adapting to local conditions, their skin hardening against the planet's acidic atmosphere, while their musculature densified to compensate for the high gravity. The Necron defenders found themselves facing an enemy that grew stronger as the battle progressed. Krork who survived initial engagements developed resistance to Gauss weapons, their bodies producing specialized cells that could partially deflect the molecular disassembly effect. When the Nightbringer itself entered the battle, the Krork responded with specialized brainboys variants who could project a primitive but effective psychic null field, temporarily limiting the Khatan's ability to manipulate reality around it. After 27 days of continuous combat, the Necrons abandoned the position, marking another rare victory for the Old Ones. However, as with the Proto-Eldar deployment, this success revealed concerning patterns. The Krork exhibited increasing aggression and autonomy as the battle progressed, sometimes ignoring commands from their Old One controllers. Their adaptations began to exceed predicted parameters, suggesting that the species might eventually evolve beyond the limitations intentionally built into their genetic code. Beyond these primary warrior races, the Old Ones created numerous specialized species for particular tactical purposes. The Ration, insected beings with natural phase-shifting abilities, could infiltrate Necron tomb complexes. The Canib, aquatic predators with advanced bioelectric organs, proved effective against Necron forces in oceanic environments. The Jakero, while not primarily combat-oriented, could intuitively understand and manipulate technology, allowing them to temporarily disable or reprogram Necron systems. As these new species entered the conflict, the fundamental nature of the war began to change. What had begun as a relatively conventional military campaign, albeit with extraordinarily advanced technology, evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. The increasing presence of psychically active beings across the battlefield created ripples in the Immaterium, which had previously been a relatively calm dimension of pure energy. These ripples began to interact and reinforce each other, creating patterns that gradually developed self-sustaining characteristics. The first indications of this transformation appeared during the Battle of Fractured Skies, where Proto-Eldar forces engaged a Necron fleet near a major webway junction. During the height of the conflict, as thousands of psychic warriors projected their powers simultaneously, a localized tier in reality briefly formed. Combatants on both sides reported witnessing impossible geometries and hearing whispers that induced immediate psychological distress. Several Proto-Eldar vessels disappeared into this anomaly, while others emerged with crews driven to homicidal madness. The Old Ones recognized this development as an unintended consequence of their creation of psychically attuned species. The Immaterium, which they had long utilized as a stable medium for faster-than-light travel and communication, was responding to the emotional emanations of their creations. Fear, rage, determination, and pain, the constant companions of warfare, were leaving impressions in the warp, creating a feedback loop that intensified with each battle. This transformation accelerated as the war expanded. Major engagements would now routinely generate warp phenomena that persisted after the battles concluded. Worlds where significant psychic activity had occurred became subject to localized reality failures, gravity fluctuations, spontaneous mutations in native life forms, and temporal anomalies that caused some regions to experience time at different rates than their surroundings. The Necrons and Khatan initially viewed these developments with detached curiosity. As beings of purely material existence, they remained largely unaffected by warp disturbances. Indeed, some Khatan recognized strategic advantages in these phenomena, deliberately targeting worlds with high concentrations of psychic species to generate reality fractures that would disable Old One defenses and communication networks. This strategy reached its apex during the Thousand World Offensive, where Necron forces under multiple Catan launched simultaneous attacks against Old One-controlled systems throughout the galactic core. The coordinated assault forced the defenders to deploy their psychic species en masse, creating a surge of warp activity that temporarily destabilized the entire region. Webway gates malfunctioned, psychic communications became unreliable, and in some systems, reality itself seemed to unravel at the edges. The Old Ones, masters of the immaterium since time immemorial, found themselves facing a crisis they had never anticipated. The dimension they had navigated with confidence for millions of years was becoming increasingly hostile and unpredictable. Their attempts to stabilize the warp through technological means proved ineffective, as the problem was not mechanical but fundamentally tied to the nature of consciousness itself. The psychic emanations of trillions of beings engaged in desperate warfare had created a new paradigm that the Old One's ancient understanding could not fully address. As the war approached its third millennium, the first truly self-aware warp entities emerged from the turbulence. These nascent consciousnesses formed around specific emotional patterns that dominated the conflict. The constant fear of death and annihilation coalesced into a presence that would later be identified as the precursor to Nurgle. The desperate ambition and hunger for victory that drove both sides gave shape to what would eventually become Tzeentch. The rage and bloodlust of the Krork and other warrior species fed the entity that would one day be known as Khorne. These entities, while not yet at the power level they would achieve in later eras, began to exert influence over psychically sensitive beings throughout the war zone. Proto-Eldar reported visions of impossible beings offering power in exchange for loyalty. Krork exhibited mutations that enhanced their combat capabilities while pushing them toward ever greater violence. Even some Old Ones found their thoughts influenced by whispers that seemed to originate from within their own minds. The Battle of Shattered Glass represented the first documented instance of direct warp entity intervention in the material universe. An Old One fleet engaged in combat with Necron forces near a contested webway gate experienced a catastrophic reality breach. Survivors reported that the void between ships seemed to bleed, with crimson tendrils reaching out to touch vessels on both sides. Old One ships affected by these manifestations reported crew members turning on each other in orgies of violence, while nearby Necron vessels experienced unprecedented system failures as reality itself rejected their presence. The war had evolved beyond a simple conflict between opposing forces. It had become a three-way struggle between the Old Ones with their psychic creations, the Necrons and their Catan masters, and the emerging entities of the warp that fed on the conflict itself. The material universe groaned under the strain of forces that operated according to fundamentally different physical laws, creating cascading failures in the basic fabric of reality. Particularly catastrophic was the Hollow Star event, where a major engagement between all three factions occurred around a strategically valuable solar system. The combined psychic output of Old One forces, the reality manipulation of multiple Catan, and the growing influence of warp entities created a phenomenon never before witnessed. The star at the system's center collapsed into a self-contained warp rift, neither black hole nor conventional stellar remnant, but a permanent wound in the materium that would continue to leak corruption for millions of years. As the Old One's situation grew increasingly desperate, they attempted more radical solutions. They accelerated the development of the webway, creating new branches specifically designed to be inaccessible to both Necrons and warp entities. They experimented with hybrid species that combined psychic sensitivity with physical resilience against Necron weapons. Most dangerously, they began to explore technologies that could potentially weaponize the warp itself, attempting to turn the growing immaterial turbulence against their Necron enemies. These desperate measures achieved limited tactical successes, but contributed to the strategic deterioration of their position. Each new psychic species or technology added to the warp's turbulence, strengthening the very entities that were emerging as a third faction in the conflict. The barriers between real space and the immaterium, once almost impermeable except at specific controlled points, became increasingly thin and permeable throughout the war zone. As the war in heaven reached its zenith, the silent King Zarek finalized his long gestating plans against the Khatan. For centuries, he had observed the star gods' growing arrogance and their casual disregard for the Necrons they claimed as allies. What had begun as a partnership of necessity had devolved into naked exploitation, with the Khatan viewing their metal servants as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. The final defeat of the Old Ones was now merely a matter of time, and Zarek knew that once this common enemy was eliminated, the Khatan would have no reason to maintain even the pretense of alliance. Deep within the most secure vaults of the Zarekan dynasty's crown world, teams of specialized cryptechs labored on technologies that should not have been possible. These scientists, selected for both their technical brilliance and their preserved capacity for loyalty to the Silent King rather than their Khatan masters, worked on weapons specifically designed to harm entities composed of pure energy. The fundamental challenge was immense. How does one damage a being that exists partially outside conventional physics? The Khatan were not merely powerful, they were fundamentally different from material creatures, their essence interwoven with the basic forces of reality itself. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A cryptech named Oltix, studying the energy patterns produced during the Khatan's feeding process, identified a quantum vulnerability that occurred during the moment of energy absorption. When consuming either stellar energy or the life force of living beings, the Khatan briefly manifested a more conventionally physical aspect that could, theoretically, be targeted by sufficiently advanced technology. This momentary weakness lasted only microseconds, but it provided the foundation for what would become the most ambitious weapons program in Necron history. The first prototype was a modified form of the quantum phase blade, incorporating elements that could disrupt the Khatan's energy matrix during their vulnerable feeding state. Initial tests against captured energy samples from lesser Khatan showed promising results. The blade could create localized disruptions in the energy pattern, effectively wounding the sample in a way previously thought impossible. However, these early weapons could inflict only minor damage, insufficient to truly threaten a fully manifested Khatan. The second generation of anti-Khatan weapons incorporated Tesseract technology, the same dimensional engineering that allowed the Necrons to create their labyrinthine pocket dimensions. These weapons could temporarily trap portions of a Khatan's essence in self-contained dimensional prisons, effectively fragmenting their consciousness. This approach proved far more effective, as it bypassed the need to destroy the Khatan's energy directly, instead separating it into manageable pieces that could be contained indefinitely. The most sophisticated anti-Khatan device was the reality-shattering bomb, a weapon so dangerous that only 3 prototypes were ever constructed. These devices exploited the Khatan's fundamental connection to the material universe, using that connection as a conduit to inflict damage. When detonated in proximity to a Khatan, the bomb would create a cascading reality fracture that could tear apart even their near-godlike essence. The cost was catastrophic damage to the fabric of space-time itself, creating wounds in reality that might never fully heal. All of this research and development occurred under conditions of absolute secrecy. The Silent King established multiple layers of security, with each team of cryptechs aware only of their specific component rather than the overall weapon system. Communications used quantum-entangled channels that could not be intercepted, and test facilities were hidden in pocket dimensions accessible only through heavily guarded Tesseract labyrinths. The Khatan, in their arrogance, never imagined that their servants could conceive of rebellion, let alone develop the means to implement it. Parallel to the weapon's development, Zarek worked to identify which Necron leaders could be trusted with knowledge of the coming betrayal. Despite the biotransference process and its programming limitations, significant variations existed in how completely different Necrons were bound to Khatan control. Some, particularly among the lower-ranked warriors and immortals, were almost entirely subsumed by command protocols. Others, mainly high-ranking pharaohs and lords with more sophisticated neural architectures, retained enough independence to potentially act against their masters if the right circumstances arose. Through his Triarch Praetorians, Zarek conducted careful assessments of every major dynasty leader, looking for signs of preserved autonomy and resentment toward the Khatan. These evaluations were disguised as routine loyalty checks, with the Praetorians presenting themselves as enforcers of Khatan authority rather than agents of potential rebellion. Those pharaohs who demonstrated both the capacity and inclination for rebellion were marked for later contact, while those too deeply enthralled were assigned to positions where they would be neutralized when the conflict began. The logistical preparations were as complex as the technological ones. Anti-Khatan weapons needed to be distributed to trusted forces throughout the Necron Empire without alerting the star gods to their existence. Command protocol override codes had to be positioned at strategic nodes in the communication network, ready to be activated simultaneously across thousands of worlds. Loyal forces needed to be gradually repositioned near major Khatan manifestation sites under the guise of standard military rotations. These preparations took centuries to complete, with Zarek calculating every move to maintain the appearance of absolute loyalty while positioning his pieces for the eventual strike. The Khatan, focused on their imminent victory over the Old Ones and the feast of life energy that would follow, failed to notice the subtle patterns that might have warned them of the coming betrayal. Their confidence in the biotransference programming and the command protocols blinded them to the possibility that their servants might find ways to circumvent these constraints. The opportunity for rebellion came at what should have been the Khatan's moment of triumph. The last major Old One strongholds had fallen, their surviving leaders fleeing into the deepest reaches of the webway beyond even the Dolmen Gate's reach. Their created races, the Proto-Eldar, Krork, and others, were scattered and disorganized, fighting desperate rearguard actions with diminishing coordination. Victory was not merely imminent but essentially achieved, with only the final consolidation of power remaining. To celebrate this victory, the Khatan gathered at a location that would later be known only as the Hollow Vaults, a massive artificial construct built at the galaxy's core specifically for this purpose. All major Khatan were present in their full glory, along with numerous lesser shards and fragments. They came to feast on the concentrated life energy harvested from conquered worlds and to plan the final phase of their dominion over the material universe. Thousands of Necron honor guards and servant units attended them, seemingly the perfect display of the new cosmic hierarchy. What the Khatan failed to realize was that every aspect of this gathering had been meticulously arranged by the Silent King. The honor guards were exclusively drawn from forces loyal to Zarek's cause. The seemingly ceremonial artifacts decorating the vast chamber were actually disguised weapons and containment devices. Even the architectural design of the Hollow Vaults incorporated features that would amplify the effects of the anti-Khatan technology when activated. The trap was set with a precision and attention to detail that reflected millions of years of Necrontyr strategic tradition. The signal to begin came not as a dramatic declaration, but as a subtle quantum pulse transmitted directly from the Silent King to his Triarch Praetorians. These elite commanders then relayed precisely timed activation codes to their assigned forces. The first indication that something was wrong came when the honor guards, previously standing in perfect ceremonial formation, suddenly shifted to tactical positions surrounding each major Khatan. Mephetron, the Deceiver, was the first to recognize the threat, its calculating intelligence perceiving the pattern of movement before its fellow Khatan. As it attempted to phase into its energy state to escape, the first anti-Khatan weapons activated, quantum disruptors that forced it to remain partially materialized. The Deceiver's cry of surprise and rage echoed through the chamber as Tesseract devices activated around it, creating dimensional barriers that prevented both escape and the summoning of reinforcements. The other Khatan reacted with varying degrees of comprehension and fury. The Nightbringer lashed out with its scythe-like appendages, destroying dozens of Necron warriors before reality-distorting weapons trapped it in a state of quantum uncertainty. the Void Dragon unleashed electromagnetic pulses that disabled nearby Necron systems, but prepared countermeasures prevented the disruption from spreading beyond the immediate area. One by one, the Catan found themselves contained and under attack from weapons specifically designed to target their vulnerabilities. The most catastrophic moment came when the 3 reality-shattering bombs were simultaneously detonated at strategic points within the hollow vaults. The resulting dimensional fractures tore through the Catan's energy matrices, shattering their unified consciousness into fragments. These fragments, still immensely powerful but no longer possessing the godlike intellect of the complete entities, were quickly captured in tesseract labyrinths, specialized prison dimensions from which even they could not escape. What followed was not a clean victory, but a desperate struggle that spread across the entire galaxy. While the Silent King had succeeded in ambushing the gathered Catan, many lesser shards and fragments had been absent from the hollow vaults. These remaining Catan, suddenly aware of the betrayal, unleashed their full power against their former servants. Stars were extinguished, planets reduced to atomic dust, and entire Necron dynasties obliterated in the backlash. The Necrons fought back with their prepared weapons and contingency plans, gradually hunting down and capturing or destroying the remaining Catan fragments. The conflict reached an intensity that dwarfed even the war against the Old Ones, with weapons deployed that violated the fundamental laws of physics. Reality itself groaned under the strain, with permanent damage inflicted on the fabric of space-time in regions where the most powerful weapons were used. On the Forge world of Seros, the Catan shard known as the Burning One unleashed stellar flares that reduced the planet's crust to molten slag, destroying 17 Necron legions before a specialized hunter-killer team managed to trap it in a tesseract labyrinth. In the Thanatos system, the Void Dragon's fragments commanded such control over technology that Necron forces were forced to deploy warrior phalanxes using only the most primitive weapons, sacrificing millions to secure a single Catan shard. Perhaps most terrible was the confrontation with the Nightbringer in the Gloaming Worlds. This region, once a center of Old One civilization, became the site of a reality-fracturing battle that lasted for decades. The Nightbringer's mastery of dimensional physics allowed it to shift between different planes of existence, emerging to strike before disappearing again. The Necrons ultimately resorted to collapsing the entire region into a self-contained pocket dimension, trapping both the Catan shard and hundreds of thousands of their own forces in an eternal prison rather than risk its escape. The aftermath of what became known as the Great Betrayal left the Necron civilization profoundly altered. Their victory had come at an immense cost. Entire dynasties had been destroyed, vast regions of space rendered uninhabitable, and their technological infrastructure severely damaged. The weapons used against the Catan had often proven as dangerous to their wielders as to their targets, creating collateral damage on a galactic scale. Most significantly, the Necrons had expended nearly all their remaining resources in this final conflict. The energy requirements for the anti-Catan weapons had drained power sources that had taken millennia to accumulate. Key manufacturing facilities had been destroyed in the fighting, making replacement of losses increasingly difficult. The command and control networks that coordinated their empire had been severely damaged, with many nodes destroyed entirely. The Silent King surveyed this devastation with the cold calculation that had become his defining characteristic. The Catan had been defeated, not destroyed completely, as that had proven impossible, but shattered into fragments and imprisoned in ways that would prevent them from ever again threatening Necron independence. The Old Ones were gone, their created races scattered and leaderless. The Necron civilization, while severely damaged, had survived and retained its autonomy. Yet this victory revealed a fundamental truth that Zarek had suspected, but could now confirm with certainty. The biotransference had been irreversible. The cryptex who had studied Catan technology most closely reported that no method existed to reverse the process and return the Necrons to biological form. The promised restoration that had motivated many to support the rebellion against the Catan was, in fact, impossible. The Necrons would remain as they were, soulless machines with fading memories of organic existence, for as long as their mechanical bodies endured. This realization spread gradually through the higher echelons of Necron society, creating a profound existential crisis. They had achieved victory against both the Old Ones and the Catan, becoming the dominant power in a galaxy now shaped by their conflicts. Yet that dominance came with the understanding that they would never again know the sensations of true life, the pleasure of taste, the comfort of touch, the warmth of genuine emotion. They had won everything and lost what mattered most. The damaged state of the galaxy presented additional challenges. The war in heaven and the subsequent conflict with the Catan had left reality itself wounded. Warp storms of unprecedented scale erupted throughout the galaxy as the Immaterium reacted to the damage inflicted on real space. Entire regions became impassable, while others experienced time dilation effects that made coordinated action impossible. The nascent warp entities that had emerged during the war against the Old Ones grew stronger, feeding on the psychic shock waves generated by billions of deaths. In the aftermath of the Great Betrayal, the Necron civilization stood victorious yet grievously wounded. The galaxy they had fought to dominate lay in ruins around them, a testament to the devastating power unleashed during their rebellion against the Catan. As the last fragments of the star gods were imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths, Silent King Zarek turned his attention to the future of his people. The Necrons had won their freedom, but the cost had been catastrophic. Zarek's personal Necrodermis form, more sophisticated than any other, allowed him to perceive the true state of the galaxy with cold clarity. The war in heaven had not merely decimated countless species and destroyed innumerable worlds, it had fundamentally damaged the fabric of reality itself. Vast regions of space had become impassable due to reality fractures, while others experienced dangerous temporal instabilities that made navigation nearly impossible. The weapons deployed against both the Old Ones and the Catan had left wounds in space-time that leaked corrupting energies into the material universe. More concerning was the state of the Immaterium. What had once been a relatively calm dimension of pure energy had transformed into a turbulent sea of psychic resonance. The countless deaths and suffering caused by the war had created self-sustaining patterns in the warp, nascent entities that fed on specific emotional emanations. These entities were growing stronger, their influence beginning to reach into real space in ways that even the soulless Necrons could detect through instrumentation. Among the most pressing issues was the rise of the younger races. The scattered remnants of Old One creations, particularly the Proto-Eldar and the Krork, were beginning to establish new civilizations from the ashes of the conflict. The Proto-Eldar, with their extraordinary psychic potential, were especially concerning. Their growing presence in the galaxy further agitated the warp, creating a feedback loop that threatened to make the Immaterium permanently hostile to stable real space. The Necron civilization itself faced critical challenges. The damage sustained during the rebellion against the Catan had severely depleted their resources. Many tomb worlds had been destroyed outright, while others suffered catastrophic damage to key systems. The specialized weapons used against the Catan had consumed vast amounts of energy, draining power sources that had taken millennia to accumulate. Manufacturing capabilities had been reduced to a fraction of their former capacity, making replacement of losses increasingly difficult. Most significantly, the Necrons themselves were deteriorating. The Necrodermis bodies, while incredibly durable, were not immune to damage and degradation over time. The constant warfare had inflicted cumulative harm that self-repair protocols could no longer fully address. Many Necrons, particularly those of lower status who had received less sophisticated bodies, were experiencing cognitive degradation as their neural pathways began to break down. Memory loss, processing errors, and personality fragmentation were becoming increasingly common. The Silent King gathered his most trusted advisors, the Triarch Praetorians and representatives from the major dynasties that had survived the conflict, to address these mounting crises. The council met within the Sanctum of Infinite Equations, a secure facility located in the heart of the Zarekan dynasty's crown world. For 60 days by standard measurement, they analyzed data, projected outcomes, and debated potential solutions. The conclusion they reached was both radical and necessary. The Necrons would enter a period of dormancy, a great sleep during which their bodies could repair, their systems could recharge, and the galaxy itself might heal from the wounds inflicted during the war in heaven. This dormancy would not be brief, but would extend for millions of years, allowing the reality fractures to stabilize and the younger races to either destroy themselves or reach a level of development where they could be properly harvested rather than simply exterminated. Implementing this great sleep required technological achievements nearly as impressive as those deployed against the Khatan. Each tomb world needed to be transformed into a stasis facility capable of maintaining millions of Necron bodies in perfect suspension for an almost unimaginable duration. Power systems had to be designed that could function autonomously for millions of years without maintenance. Security protocols needed to protect the sleeping Necrons from external threats while remaining operational long after their creators entered dormancy. The cryptechs of the Sodek dynasty, renowned for their expertise in temporal manipulation, developed the core stasis technology. Their design utilized a quantum suspension field that effectively removed the dormant Necrons from the normal flow of time. Within these fields, no degradation would occur, no energy would be consumed, and no damage could accumulate. The subjects would experience the passing of millions of years as nothing more than a momentary discontinuity in their consciousness. The implementation of these stasis chambers varied by dynasty and status. The lowest-tier Necron warriors were stored in massive honeycomb structures, their bodies packed in efficient grid patterns with minimal individual accommodation. Immortals and specialized units received more sophisticated chambers with additional monitoring systems. The nobility, lords, overlords, and pharaohs were entombed in personalized stasis crypts surrounded by treasured possessions, records of their achievements, and in some cases, the preserved remains of enemies defeated in particularly significant battles. Power generation presented a particularly complex challenge. The stasis fields themselves consumed minimal energy once established, but the security systems, maintenance constructs, and awakening mechanisms required constant power over millions of years. The solution came from the Ogdobic dynasty, whose cryptechs had specialized in stellar engineering during the war in heaven. They designed systems that could harvest energy directly from nearby stars, converting radiation into usable power through quantum collectors placed in strategic orbital positions. For tomb worlds lacking convenient stellar energy sources, alternative systems were implemented. Some utilized geothermal energy tapped from planetary cores, while others incorporated matter-antimatter reactors designed to extract energy from artificial micro-singularities. The most advanced tombs featured dimensional energy siphons that drew power from adjacent reality planes, though these were rare due to the danger of attracting unwanted attention from entities dwelling in those dimensions. The defensive systems protecting the tomb worlds during their dormancy represented some of the most sophisticated military technology in Necron arsenals. The primary defensive layer consisted of automated weapon platforms positioned throughout each tomb complex and in orbit around tomb worlds. These platforms featured scaled-down versions of the Gauss weapons used by Necron infantry, along with more exotic defenses such as particle whips and Tesla destructors. The platforms operated on simple but effective targeting protocols that classified any non-Necron entity as hostile. Supporting these static defenses were the Canoptech constructs, autonomous machines designed specifically to maintain tomb worlds during the Great Sleep. The most numerous were the Canoptech scarabs, insected machines that could repair damage to Necrodermis structures using their own bodies as raw material if necessary. These scarabs operated in swarms of thousands, constantly patrolling the tomb complexes for signs of deterioration or intrusion. Larger Canoptech constructs served more specialized functions. Canoptech spiders acted as control nodes for scarab swarms while also performing more complex maintenance tasks. Canoptech wraiths, with their phase-shifting capabilities, could pass through solid matter to access otherwise unreachable areas of the tomb complexes. Most formidable were the Canoptech Sentinels, massive guardian constructs equipped with weapons capable of eliminating almost any intruder, from individual infiltrators to small armies. The most sophisticated defensive measure was the quantum shielding that concealed tomb worlds from detection. This technology rendered the dormant Necron facilities virtually invisible to conventional scanning methods, masking energy signatures and distorting gravitational readings that might reveal their presence. In many cases, tomb worlds were buried beneath planetary surfaces or hidden within asteroids and moons, providing additional physical concealment to supplement the technological protections. Perhaps the most crucial aspect of the Great Sleep preparations was the establishment of awakening protocols. The Necrons could not simply remain dormant indefinitely. They needed precisely calibrated systems to trigger their revival at the appropriate time. The primary awakening mechanism was chronometric, designed to activate after a predetermined period, typically 60 million years, though this varied by dynasty based on their specific strategic objectives. Secondary awakening triggers responded to external stimuli that might necessitate earlier revival. These included detection of significant threats near tomb worlds, specific stellar configurations that indicated favorable tactical conditions, or the energy signatures of particularly valuable targets entering a tomb world's vicinity. Each trigger incorporated verification algorithms to prevent premature awakening due to false positives or temporary phenomena. The command structure during dormancy required careful consideration. With the majority of the leadership cast in stasis alongside their followers, each tomb world needed clear authority hierarchies for the awakening sequence. Typically, the cryptex would revive first, assessing the tomb's condition and making necessary adjustments before awakening the nobility. The pharaoh or highest-ranking overlord would then assume command and determine the sequence for reviving the remainder of the forces based on tactical requirements. As these preparations neared completion, the Silent King made his most significant decision. Rather than entering stasis with his people, Zarek chose a different path. He would surrender direct control over the Necron Empire, disconnecting himself from the command protocols that linked him to every Necron. This unprecedented act would free the dynasties to pursue their own objectives upon awakening, while allowing Zarek himself to undertake a personal journey beyond the boundaries of the galaxy. Before initiating this separation, the Silent King issued his final commands, directives that would shape Necron policy for millions of years. He established the awakening priorities, a hierarchical list of objectives to be pursued as the Necrons gradually returned to activity. Primary among these was the assessment and reclamation of tomb worlds, many of which would inevitably suffer damage or intrusion despite their defenses. Secondary priorities included the evaluation of emergent species for potential biotransference compatibility and the location of any remaining Khatan shards that might have escaped imprisonment. Most controversially, Zarek explicitly deprioritized immediate warfare against the younger races unless they directly threatened tomb worlds. This directive contradicted the conquest-oriented strategies that had dominated Necron military thinking for millions of years. The Silent King justified this approach as resource conservation. The newly awakened Necrons would need time to rebuild their strength before engaging in large-scale conflicts. However, many historians believe his true motivation was more complex, possibly related to his growing sense of responsibility for the Necrons' soulless condition. The actual implementation of the Great Sleep occurred as a carefully orchestrated sequence rather than a simultaneous event. The process began with outlying tomb worlds and gradually moved inward toward the dynasty crown worlds. This approach ensured that if unexpected problems arose during the early phases, the core leadership would remain active to address them. Each tomb world followed a standardized shutdown protocol, with defensive systems activating, canoptech constructs assuming their maintenance patterns, and stasis fields engaging in precisely calculated order. The final tomb worlds to enter dormancy were the crown worlds of the major dynasties, Mandragora of the Sodek, Geddon of the Nihilak, and Solemnis of the Trazyn dynasty among them. On each, elaborate ceremonies marked the transition to dormancy, with dynasty pharaohs delivering final addresses to their courts before entering their stasis crypts. These ceremonies varied according to dynastic traditions, some maintaining elements of the ancient Necrontyr burial rites that had persisted even through biotransference. The last active Necron facility was the Grand Chamber of Eternity on the Zarrican dynasty's crown world. Here, surrounded by the Triarch Praetorians and representatives from each major dynasty, the Silent King performed the rites of disconnection, a complex technological process that severed his direct control over the Necron command protocols. As the final connections were broken, Zarek addressed his closest advisors one last time, outlining his intention to journey beyond the galaxy's edge in search of atonement, and perhaps a solution to the Necrons' soulless existence. As the last Necron tomb worlds powered down into dormancy, the great dynasties that had once competed for dominance across the galaxy entered their 60-million-year slumber with hierarchies, traditions, and rivalries perfectly preserved. Unlike organic civilizations that evolved through generations, the Necron dynasties would emerge from the Great Sleep with their political structures intact, a civilization frozen in time, ready to resume its ancient conflicts and alliances exactly where they had paused. The Sautek dynasty established itself as the most expansionist of the major powers even before biotransference. Controlling nearly 12% of all Necron territory at the onset of the Great Sleep, the Sautek built their empire through methodical military conquest rather than technological innovation. Their crown world of Mandragora housed one of the largest tomb complexes ever constructed, with capacity for over 60 billion Necron warriors arranged in perfectly ordered ranks extending hundreds of kilometers below the planet's surface. Pharaon Imoduk, who would later be known as the Stormlord, implemented a strict military hierarchy within the Sautek dynasty that persisted through biotransference. His command structure divided forces into precisely defined echelons, each with specific tactical responsibilities and authority limitations. This rigid organization allowed the Sautek to coordinate massive campaigns across multiple star systems simultaneously, overwhelming opponents through superior logistics rather than technological advantage. The Sautek military doctrine emphasized overwhelming force application through coordinated lightning strikes, a strategy reflected in their dynastic glyph depicting a storm descending upon a shattered world. Their forces specialized in rapid deployment tactics, utilizing mass teleportation technology to position entire armies behind enemy lines within seconds. Sautek warriors bore distinctive emerald and gold markings, with nobility displaying additional bronze detailing proportional to their rank. In stark contrast to the militaristic Sautek stood the Nihilak dynasty, whose power derived from wealth accumulation rather than territorial expansion. The Nihilak controlled vast mining operations on thousands of resource-rich worlds, extracting rare minerals and exotic materials needed for the most advanced Necron technologies. Their crown world of Geddon functioned more as a treasury than a military headquarters, housing artifacts and resources collected over millions of years. Pharaon Kriasin of the Nihilak developed an economic system based on resource control rather than direct conquest. His dynasty rarely engaged in unnecessary military action, preferring to establish trading relationships with other dynasties, exchanging rare materials for military protection or technological knowledge. This approach made the Nihilak indispensable to the broader Necron civilization, while allowing them to maintain a relatively small but exceptionally well-equipped military force. The Nihilak's defensive innovations became legendary among the dynasties. Their tomb worlds featured multiple redundant security systems, including phase-shifting barriers that could relocate entire sections of a complex into pocket dimensions upon detecting intrusion. Their warriors bore turquoise and gold markings, with nobility displaying platinum embellishments that indicated both rank and specific resource responsibilities within the dynasty's economic structure. The Mefrit dynasty distinguished itself through mastery of solar manipulation technology. Controlling a relatively small territory centered around binary and trinary star systems, the Mefrit developed specialized energy weapons that harnessed and amplified stellar radiation to unprecedented destructive potential. Their crown world of Nephimoria orbited a carefully engineered artificial star that the dynasty's cryptex continuously modified to produce specific radiation signatures useful for weapons testing. Under Pharaon Kadep, the Mefrit focused almost exclusively on offensive technology development. Their Gauss weapons operated at energy outputs approximately 30% higher than standard Necron equivalents, though this power came at the cost of increased maintenance requirements and shorter operational lifespans. Mefrit forces specialized in overwhelming firepower rather than tactical flexibility, deploying in formations designed to create overlapping fields of devastatingly powerful energy discharge. The distinctive Mefrit combat doctrine emphasized concentrated fire that could penetrate any known defense. Their warriors carried weapons modified to incorporate solar collection cells that continuously recharged from ambient stellar radiation, allowing for sustained high-energy output during prolonged engagements. Mefrit Necrons bore orange, red, and gold markings reminiscent of solar flares, with nobility displaying additional white hot energy conduits running through their Necrodermis forms. Perhaps the most unusual among the major dynasties was the Nephrek, whose obsession with transcendence persisted even after biotransference. Believing that their transformation into living metal represented merely one step toward ultimate evolution, the Nephrek devoted enormous resources to dimensional research and energy state manipulation. Their crown world of Khokit existed partially in normal space and partially in a self-created pocket dimension, requiring specialized phase technology to access. Pharaon Silfek drove the Nephrek's research into what they termed the ultimate transformation, a theoretical state beyond even their Necrodermis forms where they would exist as pure energy beings similar to the Khatan, but without the limitations of physical form. This obsession led the Nephrek to develop advanced phase-shifting technology that allowed their warriors to temporarily convert portions of their bodies into energy states, passing through solid matter or avoiding damage entirely. The Nephrek's distinctive golden-white appearance resulted from their unique Necrodermis composition, which incorporated exotic materials specifically designed to facilitate energy state transition. Their nobility could generate visible auras of phase energy that distorted light around them, creating the impression of beings partially existing in another dimension. Nephrek military doctrine emphasized mobility over direct confrontation, with their forces appearing seemingly from nowhere to strike before phasing away to avoid retaliation. The Zarakan dynasty, despite being the original ruling house of the Silent King himself, maintained a surprisingly low profile compared to other major dynasties. Controlling territories scattered strategically throughout the galaxy rather than concentrated in a single region, the Zarakan operated more as administrators and arbiters than conquerors. Their crown world, whose name was purposely obscured from records accessible to other dynasties, housed the most complete archives of pre-biotransference Necrontyr history and culture. After the Silent King's departure, the Zarakan dynasty fell under the leadership of Regent Ahodek, who maintained the dynasty's traditional role as enforcers of the ancient Necrontyr codes. Zarakan forces specialized in anti-Khatan technology, maintaining containment facilities for dozens of Khatan shards and fragments. Their warriors received neural programming that made them particularly resistant to reality manipulation, allowing them to operate effectively against both Khatan remnants and warp-influenced entities. The distinctive silver and gold markings of Zarakan Necrons reflected their status as the dynasty most closely aligned with the original vision of the Silent King. Their nobility bore additional black detailing that incorporated microscopic inscriptions of the ancient Necrontyr legal codes, visible only at certain angles and lighting conditions. Zarakan military doctrine emphasized precision and efficiency rather than overwhelming force, deploying smaller but perfectly coordinated forces to achieve objectives with minimal resource expenditure. Beyond these major powers existed dozens of minor dynasties, each controlling anything from a handful of tomb worlds to substantial territories comprising hundreds of star systems. The Thok dynasty specialized in electromagnetic manipulation, their warriors generating crackling fields of blue energy that disrupted enemy technology. The Navak dynasty embraced close combat specialization unusual among Necrons, modifying their warriors with specialized melee weapons and enhanced reaction protocols. The Ogdobic dynasty focused on temporal manipulation technology, their forces sometimes appearing to move at impossible speeds as they selectively accelerated their personal time streams. The political structures within dynasties reflected the highly stratified society of the original Necrontyr civilization, now frozen permanently in Necrodermis. At the apex stood the pharaoh, the absolute ruler whose authority within their dynasty was theoretically unlimited. Below them served the court, consisting of overlords who administered specific territories or military formations. These overlords in turn commanded lords who handled day-to-day operations and led forces in battle. The cryptex occupied a unique position within this hierarchy. Technically subordinate to the nobility, these technological specialists possessed knowledge that made them indispensable. Organized into specialized collectives called conclaves, cryptex focused on distinct disciplines. Plasmancers mastered energy manipulation, geomancers controlled gravitational and tectonic forces, ethermancers specialized in interstellar communications and sensor technology, chronomancers studied temporal physics, and psychomancers researched methods to counter or mimic psychic phenomena despite the Necrons' soulless nature. Destroyer cults represented a disturbing deviation within many dynasties. These specialized forces suffered from a form of logic corruption that manifested as an obsessive desire to eliminate all organic life. The condition, known as the Destroyer Curse, could affect Necrons of any rank, progressively eroding their personality until nothing remained but genocidal purpose. Affected individuals modified their bodies with increasingly destructive weaponry, sacrificing mobility and even basic self-preservation protocols to maximize killing efficiency. Most dynasties quarantined their destroyer cults on designated worlds, deploying them only when facing particularly resilient organic opposition. The destroyers' single-minded focus made them effective if unpredictable assets, though their tendency to continue attacking long after strategic objectives had been achieved often created unnecessary resource expenditure. The most advanced cases of the Destroyer Curse produced specialized variants like Skorpek destroyers, who modified themselves with multiple limbs bearing close combat weapons, or Lockhust heavy destroyers, who integrated their consciousness directly into mobile artillery platforms. Inter-dynasty relationships before the Great Sleep formed a complex web of alliances, vassalages, and cold conflicts. The Sodek and Nihilak maintained a mutually beneficial arrangement where Nihilak mining operations received Sodek military protection in exchange for priority access to rare materials. The Mefret dynasty supplied specialized energy weapon components to the Nefrek in return for phase-shifting technology that improved their solar collection capabilities. The Zarekin maintained formal diplomatic relations with all major dynasties while secretly monitoring their activities for compliance with the Silent King's final directives. These relationships were formalized through the codes of battle, ancient protocols, established during the original Necrontyr period and maintained through biotransference. The codes regulated everything from resource disputes to territorial expansion, establishing procedures for both diplomatic resolution and ritualized warfare when necessary. Under these rules, dynasties could declare legitimate grievances against one another, with conflicts resolved through specific military engagements rather than total war. The technological variations between dynasties extended beyond mere specialization into fundamental design philosophy. The Sodek emphasized reliability and mass production, creating weapons and vehicles that could be readily replicated across their vast forces. The Nihilak prioritized longevity and precision, producing technologies that required more resources but functioned flawlessly for millennia without maintenance. The Mefret focused on maximum energy output regardless of efficiency, while the Nefrek sacrificed raw power for dimensional manipulation capabilities. These technological divergences manifested most visibly in each dynasty's signature war machines. Sodek Doomsday Arcs featured reinforced power distribution systems that reduced firepower but increased operational reliability. Nihilak Ghost Arcs incorporated additional quantum reconstruction matrices that could restore damaged warriors to full functionality rather than merely stabilizing them for later repair. Mefrit Doomsides carried enhanced energy projection systems that extended their death ray range by approximately 40% at the cost of increased energy consumption. The Nephrek modified their annihilation barges with partial phase technology that allowed their energy shields to temporarily shift incoming attacks into alternate dimensions rather than absorbing or deflecting them. The Zarekin maintained the purest forms of original Necron technology, their war machines adhering precisely to the designs first developed during the rebellion against the Khatan with minimal dynasty-specific modification. As the Great Sleep commenced, each dynasty programmed its awakening protocols according to specific strategic objectives. The Sodek set their systems to prioritize military asset revival, ensuring their warriors would awaken before support structures to immediately secure their territories. The Nihilak programmed staged awakening sequences that would first activate specialized units to assess and secure resource deposits before reviving their main forces. The Mefrit calibrated their systems to awaken in response to specific stellar conditions optimal for their solar-based weaponry. The Nephrek implemented perhaps the most complex awakening protocols, designing systems that would revive different portions of their forces based on dimensional energy readings that indicated favorable conditions for their phase technology. The Zarekin programmed their tomb worlds to activate in a carefully coordinated sequence that would allow them to assess the galaxy's condition before committing to large-scale reemergence. These diverse approaches to the Great Sleep reflected the fundamental character of each dynasty, their values, priorities, and strategic vision for the eventual reawakening. Though they entered dormancy as parts of a unified Necron civilization, the programming ensured they would emerge as distinct powers ready to pursue their own agendas in the changed galaxy they would eventually face. The first tomb world to stir from its eons-long slumber was not one of the mighty crown worlds of the major dynasties, but a minor outpost on the fringes of what would later be designated the Vidar sector. In the 744th year of the 41st millennium, the dormant systems of Nephthys detected unusual energy signatures penetrating its outer defenses, a human mining expedition whose thermal charges had inadvertently breached the tomb's outer chambers. Automatic defense protocols activated precisely as they had been programmed to do 60 million years earlier, but the extended dormancy had taken its toll. Power fluctuations rippled through the awakening systems, causing cascading failures in the revival protocols. The Canoptech constructs, which had maintained their endless patrol patterns throughout the long millennia, responded to the intrusion with mechanical efficiency. Swarms of scarabs emerged from hidden recesses, their metallic carapaces gleaming under the harsh artificial lighting as they converged on the human miners. The terrified humans, equipped only with industrial drilling equipment, stood no chance against even these maintenance constructs. Their deaths triggered further alert protocols within the tomb complex, accelerating the awakening sequence beyond its intended parameters. Deep within the stasis crypts, the first Necron warriors began to rise. Their reactivation should have been carefully phased, with diagnostic protocols ensuring each warrior functioned properly before awakening the next. Instead, entire sections activated simultaneously, overtaxing power distribution networks that had degraded despite the Canoptech construct's best efforts. Many warriors emerged with significant damage, limbs missing, optical sensors malfunctioning, neural pathways corrupted by millions of years of atomic decay that even the stasis fields could not completely prevent. The awakening of Overlord Thasar occurred 17 hours after the initial breach. His stasis chamber, more sophisticated than those housing the common warriors, performed a comprehensive diagnostic scan before allowing consciousness to return. Thasar's first awareness was of system failure reports flooding his neural network, critical power shortages, defense perimeter breaches, and most concerning, corruption in the central command protocols that should have coordinated the tomb's revival. Thasar's immediate assessment revealed the extent of the disaster. Nearly 40% of Nephthys' warrior complement had suffered critical damage during awakening, rendering them combat ineffective. Another 30% had activated, but remained trapped in their stasis chambers due to mechanical failures in the release mechanisms. The tomb's main power distribution network operated at less than 60% capacity, with several key nodes completely offline. Most concerning was the status of the cryptechs who should have managed the awakening process. All three remained in stasis, their revival chambers damaged beyond the repair capabilities of the available canoptech constructs. This scenario would repeat itself thousands of times across the galaxy over the following centuries. Tomb worlds awakened prematurely due to external disturbances, mining operations, colonial expansion, seismic activity, or simple cosmic accident. In almost every case, the revival process occurred under suboptimal conditions, resulting in widespread damage and malfunction among the awakening Necrons. On Thanatos, crown jewel of the Oroscar dynasty and home to the legendary celestial orrery, the awakening began after a passing Eldar vessel's shadow field generators created resonance patterns that triggered the tomb's perimeter sensors. The revival protocols activated flawlessly at first, with primary cryptechs emerging to assess the situation before proceeding with further awakening sequences. However, during the 60 million years of dormancy, a microscopic fracture had developed in one of the quantum energy conduits supplying the main stasis chambers. When full power was diverted to these chambers to revive the dynasty's nobility, the conduit catastrophically failed, releasing a surge of uncontained energy that corrupted the neural pathways of over 200 Necron lords and permanently damaged the Oroscar Pharaon's memory engrams. The resulting leadership vacuumed through the Oroscar dynasty into disarray. Secondary command protocols activated, transferring authority to Cryptech Tohulk, whose specialty in gravitational engineering made him ill-suited for military command. Tohulk's first priority became securing the celestial orrery, the galaxy's most dangerous strategic asset, rather than establishing a broader awakening plan for the dynasty's remaining tomb worlds. This decision, while tactically sound for preventing the orrery from falling into unauthorized hands, significantly delayed the Oroscar dynasty's re-emergence as a major power. The Sodek dynasty experienced a more coordinated but still deeply flawed awakening. Their primary tomb world of Mandragora activated according to schedule in the 39th millennium, triggered by astronomical alignments that had been calculated 60 million years earlier. The revival process followed the carefully structured military protocols established by Pharaon Imodic, with command-level Necrons awakening first to assess the strategic situation before reviving the broader forces. However, even this relatively successful awakening revealed the toll of the Great Sleep. Approximately 28% of Sodek warriors emerged with significant combat effectiveness reductions due to physical damage or neural degradation. More concerning was the loss of personality among many mid-tier commanders. Lords who had once been skilled tactical thinkers now operated according to basic programming, their more sophisticated decision-making capabilities eroded by subtle atomic-level decay in their neural matrices. Pharaon Imodic himself suffered memory fragmentation that erased significant portions of his pre-biotransference existence. While his tactical acumen and command capabilities remained intact, the personal history that had shaped his character was now reduced to disconnected fragments. This pattern of memory loss proved common among awakening Necron nobility across all dynasties, further distancing them from their original Necrontyr identities and values. Perhaps the most catastrophic awakening occurred within the Atun dynasty, whose crown world of Naganu experienced a containment failure in its primary power core during revival initiation. The resulting quantum feedback cascaded through the stasis systems, corrupting the neural patterns of nearly the entire dynastic court. When the survivors emerged, they discovered that their Pharaon and 7 highest-ranking overlords had developed severe processing errors that manifested as a form of digital megalomania, each believing themselves to be the legitimate ruler of not merely the dynasty, but the entire Necron race. The resulting civil conflict devastated what remained of the Atun dynasty. Necron fought Necron through the halls of their own tomb complex, deploying weapons that had been designed for use against the old ones and Catan against their own kind. By the time a semblance of stability was restored, with Overlord Theptes claiming control over the remnants, the dynasty had lost nearly 70% of its military assets and all but 2 of its senior cryptechs. The Aton dynasty, once among the most culturally sophisticated Necron powers, was reduced to a minor player controlling only a handful of fully functional tomb worlds. The Mephrit dynasty's awakening demonstrated a different kind of failure. Their solar manipulation technology, which had given them significant advantages during the war in Heaven, proved catastrophically unstable after millions of years of dormancy. When their primary tomb world of Nephimoria began its revival sequence, the artificial star that powered their civilization experienced unexpected fluctuations. The carefully engineered stellar body, designed to produce specific radiation signatures optimal for Mephrit technology, underwent a partial collapse that flooded the tomb complexes with radiation beyond even Necron tolerance thresholds. The resulting damage affected the Mephrit's specialized energy weapons most severely. Across their awakening forces, weapon systems experienced critical failures, with many warriors finding their integrated Gauss flares inoperable or dangerously unstable. Mephrit cryptechs, reviving to this crisis, devoted their immediate efforts to stabilizing their technology rather than expanding the awakening to other dynasty holdings. This inward focus allowed rival dynasties to establish control over territories that had historically belonged to the Mephrit, creating territorial disputes that would persist for millennia. Not all awakenings were equally compromised. The Nihilak dynasty, whose focus on quality over quantity had shaped their pre-sleep preparations, experienced a more controlled revival when their crown world of Geddon activated in the 38th millennium. Their emphasis on redundant systems and superior materials yielded a significantly higher functionality rate among awakening forces. Approximately 82% of Nihilak warriors emerged at full combat effectiveness, compared to the 40 to 60% average across other dynasties. This relative success allowed Pharaon Kriasan to implement a methodical expansion strategy, selectively awakening secondary tomb worlds only after establishing secure supply lines and communication networks. The Nihilak prioritized the recovery of their vast resource repositories, many of which had remained perfectly preserved in specialized stasis vaults. Access to these pre-sleep resources gave them significant advantages in repairing damaged forces and restoring compromised systems, establishing the Nihilak as one of the most rapidly resurgent dynasties despite their relatively small territorial holdings. The awakening process revealed previously unknown vulnerabilities in Necron physiology and technology. The most disturbing was the emergence of the Flayer virus, a degenerative condition first observed among warriors awakening on the tomb world of Sadon. Affected Necrons developed an obsessive compulsion to strip flesh from living victims and drape it over their metal bodies in a grotesque simulation of their lost organic forms. More troubling than the behavior itself was its transmissible nature. The condition spread from one Necron to another through unknown means, possibly a form of corrupted code that transferred during standard data exchanges. Many dynasties established quarantine protocols for Flayer-infected forces, isolating them on designated worlds where their degenerative condition could not spread to unaffected populations. However, the virus proved remarkably resilient, occasionally bypassing even the most sophisticated containment measures. The Navak dynasty suffered particularly severe outbreaks, losing nearly 30% of their awakened forces to the condition before establishing effective countermeasures. The destroyer cult phenomenon, which had existed before the Great Sleep as a relatively rare condition, emerged with alarming frequency among awakening Necrons. Warriors and even lords who had entered stasis as normal members of their dynasty awakened with their neural pathways fundamentally altered, their personalities replaced by a single overriding directive to eradicate all organic life. Unlike the Flayer virus, the destroyer condition did not appear transmissible, instead manifesting spontaneously among individuals whose neural matrices had degraded in specific patterns during dormancy. These destroyers modified their bodies to maximize combat effectiveness, often at the expense of mobility or self-preservation capabilities. The most extreme cases, known as heavy destroyers, integrated their consciousness directly into weapon platforms capable of devastating anti-personnel or anti-vehicle firepower. While tactically valuable in certain combat scenarios, destroyers proved difficult to control, often continuing attacks long after strategic objectives had been achieved, and occasionally targeting organic species that dynasties had intended to preserve for future use. The Nephrec dynasty's awakening highlighted yet another unforeseen consequence of the Great Sleep. Their specialized phase technology, which had allowed them to partially exist in alternative dimensions, experienced unpredicted interactions with reality fluctuations that had occurred during their dormancy. When the primary Nephrec tomb complex on Khokit began its revival sequence, approximately 15% of awakening Necrons materialized with portions of their bodies permanently phased out of normal space-time, limbs that existed partially in alternate dimensions, sensory apparatus that perceived realities beyond the material plane, or power cores that drew energy from spaces between conventional reality. These phase-shifted Nephrec exhibited unusual capabilities, including limited precognition and the ability to interact with entities that existed primarily in the warp despite the Necron's soulless nature. However, they also suffered severe operational limitations, with many experiencing uncontrollable phase shifting that temporarily removed them from material reality at unpredictable intervals. Nephrec cryptechs devoted substantial resources to studying these anomalies, hoping to harness their potential while mitigating their destabilizing effects. The Zarakan dynasty, as befitted their status as the Silent King's own house, maintained the most complete functional integrity during awakening. Their tomb worlds, constructed with materials and technologies slightly superior to those available to other dynasties, activated with approximately 75% effectiveness, significantly higher than the galactic average. More importantly, the Zarakan command structure remained largely intact, with the succession protocols established before the Great Sleep transferring authority smoothly to Regent Ahodek and the designated Council of Overlords. The return of Zarek, the Silent King, to the galaxy in the late 41st millennium sent shockwaves through the awakening Necron dynasties. After 60 million years of self-imposed exile beyond the galactic rim, the last ruler of the unified Necrontyr Empire had witnessed a threat so significant that it compelled him to break his vow of penance. The Tyranids, a wholly alien presence consuming all biomass in their path, represented an existential crisis, not just for the younger races that now dominated the stars, but for the Necrons themselves. Zarek's vessel first appeared at the edges of the Charnavok dynasty's territory, a massive construct of impossible geometry that dwarfed even the largest Necron tomb ships. The Silent King brought with him knowledge gained from his time in the intergalactic void, observations of the Tyranid Hive fleet's true scale and origin. What the galaxy was experiencing, he revealed to the assembled Necron lords, were merely tendrils of a vastly larger organism probing into the Milky Way. Should the main Tyranid mass arrive, no force in the galaxy would be sufficient to stop it. This threat provided Zarek with the perfect catalyst for his reunification agenda. The Necrons, fragmented by the Great Sleep and pursuing disparate goals since awakening, needed to consolidate their power before the full Tyranid invasion arrived. More importantly, the Tyranids threatened to consume all organic life in the galaxy, life that the Necrons themselves required if they ever hoped to reverse biotransference and reclaim flesh bodies. The Silent King's return was met with varied responses from the major dynasties. The Zarakan dynasty immediately pledged loyalty to their returned master, mobilizing their forces according to his strategic directives. The Sadek under Amodok acknowledged Zarek's authority while carefully maintaining their territorial autonomy, committing forces to specific anti-Tyranid operations while continuing their own expansion campaigns. The Nihilak offered technological support rather than direct military assets, providing advanced anti-organic weaponry specifically calibrated for Tyranid biology. Other dynasties proved less cooperative. The Mefrit viewed the Silent King's return with suspicion, questioning whether the entity claiming to be Zarek was truly the same being who had led them into the Great Sleep. The Nefrek, increasingly focused on their dimensional transcendence research, contributed minimal resources to the unification effort, considering the material galaxy, and by extension, the Tyranid threat, increasingly irrelevant to their ultimate goals. Despite these challenges, Zarek began implementing a comprehensive strategy for Necron resurgence. His plan operated on multiple timescales simultaneously: immediate tactical responses to Tyranid incursions, medium-term consolidation of Necron territories and assets, and long-term research into both biotransference reversal and galactic-scale defenses against the main Tyranid invasion. Central to Zarek's immediate strategy was the establishment of containment zones around major Tyranid hive fleet incursions. Utilizing the Celestial Orrery's predictive capabilities, Necron forces were positioned at critical nodal points where they could intercept Tyranid splinter fleets before they reached resource-rich systems. These operations often placed Necron forces in proximity to Imperial or Eldari defenders, creating uncomfortable temporary alignments against the common threat. The Silent King authorized limited technological sharing with select dynasties to enhance anti-Tyranid capabilities. Specialized weapons were distributed that could disrupt the Tyranid synapse network or introduce targeted molecular disassembly agents into their biological systems. Particularly effective were modified scarab swarms programmed to consume Tyranid biomass and convert it into raw materials for Necron reconstruction protocols, turning the Great Devourer's strength against itself. Beyond the Tyranid threat, Zarek's return catalyzed diverse approaches to the Necron's future among the different dynasties. The most straightforward path was exemplified by Emotic the Stormlord, whose Sodek dynasty pursued traditional conquest and expansion. Controlling nearly 24 fully awakened tomb worlds by the late 41st millennium, the Sotek methodically reclaimed territory through overwhelming military force, establishing clear hierarchical control over conquered regions. Emotic's approach represented continuation rather than innovation, the same strategies that had served the Necrons during the War in Heaven, updated for current galactic conditions. His forces targeted Imperial worlds with specific resource profiles or strategic positions, systematically eliminating resistance and establishing permanent Necron presence through transplanted tomb complexes and automated harvesting systems. Captured populations were typically processed as labor units, their consciousness suppressed by neural inhibitor fields while their bodies performed necessary functions under Necron direction. A dramatically different approach emerged under Trazyn the Infinite, whose Nihilak dynasty subfaction focused on preservation rather than conquest. Trazyn's vast museum tomb on Solemnis housed millions of specimens from throughout galactic history, perfectly preserved in stasis fields. His collecting expeditions targeted culturally or historically significant individuals and artifacts, with particular emphasis on preserving examples of species facing extinction. Trazyn viewed his preservation efforts as a form of redemption for the Necrons' role in ancient galactic devastation. By maintaining perfect records of civilizations and species, he created a living archive that could theoretically allow for their reconstitution should appropriate biological templates become available. His agents operated throughout the galaxy, often appearing during moments of historical significance to capture key individuals or objects before they were lost forever. This preservation approach extended beyond mere collection. On several occasions, Trazyn released portions of his collection, including once-living warriors from various eras, to intervene in conflicts that threatened particularly valuable cultural repositories. During the fall of Cadia, he deployed historical assets ranging from Horus Heresy-era Space Marines to inquisitorial forces from the Age of Apostasy, temporarily turning the tide against Chaos forces threatening to destroy irreplaceable Imperial records and artifacts. Perhaps the most scientifically ambitious approach to the Necrons' future was pursued by Orican, the diviner of the Sodek dynasty. A master chronomancer whose predictive algorithms bordered on true precognition, Orican focused on temporal manipulation as a potential path to redemption. His research suggested that the biotransference process might be reversible not through conventional technology, but through precise temporal intervention at the moment of the original transformation. Orican's experiments involved creating localized time distortions where alternative outcomes could be tested without disrupting the broader timeline. These probability bubbles allowed him to examine counterfactual scenarios. What might have happened had the Necrontyr rejected the Khatan's offer, or had they developed different approaches to immortality? While most of these experiments failed to produce viable solutions, they generated valuable data on the fundamental nature of consciousness transfer and its relationship to temporal mechanics. The most radical approach came from the cryptex of the Technomandrite Conclave, who pursued direct technological solutions to the biotransference problem. Operating from secret facilities throughout Nephrec territory, these specialists worked on creating hybrid organic Necrodermis bodies that could potentially house Necron consciousness while providing organic sensory experiences and reproductive capabilities. Their most promising research involved reverse engineering the original biotransference technology using Khatan shards as research subjects. By studying how the Khatan had separated the Necrontyr's consciousness from their souls during the original process, the Technomandrites hoped to develop methods for recombining these elements. Their experiments with captured members of younger races produced several prototype bodies that demonstrated limited success in sustaining transferred consciousness, though all subjects experienced severe psychological degradation after transfer. The ultimate goal shared by most Necron dynasties remained the reclamation of the galaxy from what they considered usurper races. From the Necron perspective, the galaxy rightfully belonged to them as the oldest surviving civilization. The younger races, particularly humans, Eldari, and orcs, were viewed as temporary occupants whose brief dominion would eventually end, returning the stars to their proper masters. This reclamation took different forms depending on dynastic philosophy. The Sodek pursued direct military conquest, systematically expanding their territory through conventional warfare. The Nihilak employed economic domination, controlling critical resources and establishing dependency relationships with younger race outposts. The Mephrit developed specialized weapons designed to eliminate organic life while leaving infrastructure intact, allowing for efficient repurposing of conquered territories. The Necrons' relationship with other major galactic powers remained complex and varied by dynasty. The Imperium of Man, as the dominant power in the galaxy, received most of the Necrons' strategic attention. Some dynasties, particularly those following Zarek's directives, established limited non-aggression agreements with specific Imperial sectors to focus on the Tyranid threat. Others viewed humanity as a resource to be harvested, either as research subjects for biotransference experiments or as labor units for resource extraction operations. The Eldari presented a more complicated case. As descendants of the Old One's most sophisticated creations, they triggered ancient enmity in many Necron lords. However, their advanced understanding of consciousness transfer through infinity circuits and their experience with soul preservation techniques made them valuable research subjects for Necrons pursuing biotransference reversal. Several dynasties established cautious information sharing arrangements with specific craftworlds, trading archaeological data about Old One sites for Eldari insights into soul energy manipulation. The Tyranid threat created unexpected alignment opportunities. On worlds like Geddon Prime, Necron and Imperial forces coordinated defensive operations against Hive Fleet Chronos, with cryptech datalinks providing tactical information to Imperial commanders, while Guard heavy weapons units provided covering fire for Necron phase harvesters targeting Tyranid synapse creatures. These alliances remained strictly temporary and limited to specific engagements, but they demonstrated the possibility of cooperation against existential threats. As the 42nd millennium dawned, with the galaxy split by the Cicatrix Maledictum and beset by multiple catastrophic threats, the Necrons found themselves in a paradoxical position. They were simultaneously among the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy, and yet fundamentally vulnerable due to their inability to replace losses. Each destroyed Necron represented an irreplaceable resource, as the technology and knowledge to create new Necrodermis bodies had been largely lost during the Great Sleep. This tension between power and vulnerability shaped Necron's strategy at every level. Pharaons committed forces carefully, prioritizing recovery of damaged units over territorial gains. Cryptex devoted significant resources to improving reanimation protocols and developing more efficient repair systems. Even aggressive dynasties like the Sodek implemented strict casualty thresholds for military operations, withdrawing forces when losses approached predetermined levels regardless of tactical situation. The future of the Necrontyr ultimately rested on their ability to adapt to a galaxy fundamentally changed from the one they had once dominated. Their technology remained superior to that of most younger races in many respects, but their diminished numbers and fragmented leadership limited their ability to leverage these advantages on a galactic scale. The Great Sleep, intended as a period of restoration, had instead accelerated their decline through cumulative degradation and data loss. Yet even in this diminished state, the Necrons represented one of the few forces capable of addressing the galaxy's most significant threats. Their weapons could permanently destroy demons that Imperial forces could only temporarily banish. Their phase technology could counter Tyranid adaptation mechanisms by shifting battle parameters beyond biological response capabilities. Their temporal manipulation systems offered theoretical defenses against the most catastrophic warp phenomena generated by the Cicatrix maledictum. As tomb worlds continued to awaken across the galaxy, often in unpredictable patterns and states of functionality, the final chapter of the Necrontyr civilization remained unwritten. Whether they would reclaim their position as the galaxy's dominant species, find a path to restore their organic forms, or gradually fade as their ancient technology failed beyond repair, remained uncertain. What was clear was that the silent legions of living metal would continue to shape galactic events for millennia to come, their ancient minds calculating possibilities across timescales incomprehensible to the younger races who now walked among the stars they once ruled absolutely. The dreams of the Necrontyr, those radiation-scarred beings who had sought immortality so long ago, lived on in their mechanical descendants. Though twisted by the Great Sleep and the cruel betrayal of the Khatan, the essential drive that had defined their species remained, the determination to endure, to overcome, and ultimately to triumph over the fundamental limitations of existence itself. In this, perhaps, the Necrontyr had achieved a form of immortality after all, not the one they had sought, but one forged through adversity and tempered by time beyond measure.